Hello, it's him. He did it. He's the killer. Get him. I apologize. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case known as the Blue Moon Murders. Viewer discretion is advised. July 31st, 2015, Pensacola, Florida. Yep, that explains the guy. The Pensacola Sheriff's Department is asked to do a welfare check here at this home. This is because a 49-year-old Department of Homeland Security employee lives at this house, but he hasn't been heard from at all in several days. When police arrive, the doors are all locked, and so they have to call a relative for permission to enter the home. So they have to call this guy, Donald Hartung. God, even your name is old and dusty. Because it's his mom and his two half-brothers who live there. When police enter the home, it's a mess. It's cluttered. There is stuff everywhere. But they also see blood on the carpets, blood on the walls, and these giant piles of clothing. When they take the clothing off of these piles, they uncover something horrific. Underneath these piles of clothing are bodies. 3 bodies, to be exact. 2 of them are found near the kitchen, and 1 is in the doorway of a bedroom. The bodies are confirmed to be that of 77-year-old widow Von Seal Smith and Von Seal's 2 sons, 47-year-old John Smith and 49-year-old Richard Smith, who was the Department of Homeland Security employee. The house was a nightmare of a crime scene to investigate. I mean, there was just stuff all over the place. This house was not kept in neat and tidy order. So they end up bringing in Donald Hartung, who is Von Seal's son and the half-brother to the 2 other victims, into the police station just to question him. As they're doing so, they're actually looking into and searching Donald Hartung's home. In the home, they find what they describe as a pagan ritual room. Donald had books on witchcraft, and so the investigator said he must be a Wiccan. And the sheriff would actually famously go on television and say very profoundly, yeah, these are ritualistic killings. This is a ritual murder, without any actual evidence to prove that. Apparently they found out that they would want to keep, if they're doing a ritual, to keep these bodies warm, and that's why there were piles of clothes on top of them. And they were being kept warm because a blue moon was occurring within a couple of days. And so the media ran with this and called this the Blue Moon Murders. The sheriff's department, I think, really regretted their decision to say this was ritualistic, because this didn't just stop in Florida. Now the entire world knew this. At Donald Hartung's home, they found clothing with some blood on it. But really, other than that, there wasn't a lot of physical evidence found at his home, because he didn't live in the house with them, that would link him directly to the murders. He goes over to his mom's house, I guess, once a week on Tuesdays to cook the 3 of them dinner. He says that's the last time he saw them, and they were alive when he left. However, in the crime scene, they find a trash can, and when they take some of the top items off, they see some bloody paper towels that's confirmed to have the blood of the victims, and on top of those paper towels are cigarettes, several cigarettes. They take those and swab them all for DNA, and they get a profile from them. Well, the Kroger brand Crypt Keeper, he actually willingly gave his DNA. The DNA on those cigarettes was his, on top of the bloody paper towels, indicating he threw those cigarettes in there after he threw the paper towels in there. Oh my God, he's reading people's thoughts. But what was his motive? Because it wasn't a ritualistic thing. They learned from some of his co-workers that he said he would inherit everything the family owned, money and everything, if his mom and both of his half-brothers were dead. Because Von Seal did not include him in the will. However, if all 3 of them were dead, he would inherit everything. At the house, they found valuables, thousands of dollars in cash, jewelry. None of it was stolen. Well, sure, because Donald Hartung wouldn't need to steal any of that. He was about to inherit it all. Then they got a letter from a jailhouse informant. And yes, usually jailhouse informants, they're just doing it for themselves, and they really shouldn't be trusted that much. But this guy here shared a cell with Donald Hartung. He told information to prosecutors that Donald Hartung told him about the murders. These weren't things publicized in the news and newspapers, nowhere. There is no way in hell he would know the information he told prosecutors unless the killer told him. And he confirmed that Donald Hartung said that Donald killed the family to inherit all of the money, which would have been about $1 million. So Great Value brand Mitch McConnell goes on trial for the 3 murders. Most of the evidence is pretty much circumstantial, but it's strong circumstantial evidence. A jury finds him guilty, and he is sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without parole. He slit his own family members' throats and beat them with claw hammers. There was evidence that he tortured his mother before killing her. He looks like a monster, and he is a monster. May he rot in hell. She said another woman was living inside of her body, and that's what caused her to murder. Okay. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Betty Jo Green. Viewer discretion is advised. I don't really have many photos for this one, sorry about that. But Betty Jo Green, she had married her first husband when she was 22 years old. He died in 1978. Less than a year goes by and she's already married to another man, a man named Glenn Orman Green. That's where she got her last name Green. By the end of that year, in November of 1978, Glenn Orman Green was dead, seemingly of natural causes. Then Glenn Orman Green's sister, Grace Blankenship, well, she dies in 1979, also seemingly of natural causes. In December of 1981, Betty Jo Green's employer, W.E. Bill Brooks, also died, again, seemingly of natural causes. Betty Jo Green had found herself a new fiancé by about 1984 or so. His name was Arthur Self. By the end of 1984, Arthur Self is hospitalized for some very extreme illness. An illness so bad he became partially paralyzed from it. Well, after doing some extensive testing and blood work, they determined that Arthur Self had very high levels of arsenic in his system. Well, police began to investigate this, and they determined the only way he could have gotten it was from his fiancée, which led them to question the other deaths that had occurred. So they exhumed the bodies of Glenn Orman Green and his sister Grace Blankenship. Lo and behold, both of them had very high levels of arsenic in their system. Both of them had been murdered. Well, they were both directly connected to Betty Jo Green, and now her fiancé is getting the same poison. So they issue a warrant for her arrest, Betty Jo Green's, and they find her, and this is all happening, by the way, in Athens, Alabama. So she is charged with 2 murders and 1 attempted murder. They also look into the death of her employer, W.E. Bill Brooks. They exhume his body, and they also found traces of arsenic in his system, but not high levels. He was being poisoned, but it wasn't enough to kill him. And so his death remained as natural causes, and she was not charged with it. So she goes on trial, and she says that it wasn't her committing these murders. It was her body doing it. But it was another woman possessing her on the left side of her body. Oh, the left side. Okay, so if it was the right side of her body, I would have been like, you're crazy as shit. But left side? No, I get it. But it was this left side woman in her body committing these murders. The jury's like, okay, you crazy, but sane enough to murder. So they found her guilty of the 2 murders and the attempted murder. She got life in prison without the possibility of parole. Familial DNA would help solve a 25-year-old murder mystery. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Angela Kleinsorge. Viewer discretion is advised. Angela was born on June 11th, 1907, and she was born in Germany. Eventually, she ended up moving to the States. She would marry, they had children, and they were living in the San Diego, California area. It was Leap Day, February 29th, 1992. Angela's daughter, who had called her every single day, they spoke on the phone every single day, had called her, but Angela didn't answer this time. She called back a little bit later, no answer. Called back a few more hours later, still no answer. The daughter rushes to her mother's home. When she goes inside, she finds something that no child should ever see. The brutally murdered body of her 84-year-old mother. She had been stabbed to death, and later they would determine she was also sexually assaulted. This was during a time where I guess there were other fatal stabbings that occurred in the same general area. But ultimately, it was determined that Angela's, at least, was not related to the other ones. They were having a very difficult time with investigating this because back in 1992, while they were able to collect DNA left behind, they really couldn't do much with it, and it didn't match anyone. They would end up putting out recreation videos of the crime to see if this will help jog anyone's memory. There was forced entry in her home. The perpetrator, it seemed, had entered through a window, but they really had very small amounts of evidence that they were able to link to anyone. And unfortunately, this case would go cold pretty quickly. 25 years later, DNA technology has advanced greatly. By 2016, they're able to do the familial DNA testing that had become popular at that time, or was new at that time, that kind of began the popularity of it. And when they took the male bodily fluid found with her case and plugged it in, it wouldn't match anyone directly, but because of familial DNA, it helped them get to a certain family, because it had a partial match to a convict who was dead. That convict had two brothers. One of them was still alive, the other brother was dead also, because that other brother had died in a car crash in 2006. They are able to get approval from the living brother. They take his DNA. It doesn't match him, but it does put them on the right track. The third brother, who died in 2006 in the accident, was named Jeffrey Falls. It just so happens to be that he lived across the street from Angela at the time of her murder. Well, the coroner actually still had some tissue samples from his autopsy. So San Diego police was able to obtain that. They created a partial DNA profile, compared it against the DNA left behind with Angela's body. It was a match. Jeffrey Falls was her killer. They'll never know why he did it, and sadly, Angela will never get true justice. A woman is found dead at the bottom of a staircase, and the age-old question, did the husband do it? Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Leslie Buck. Viewer discretion is advised. Leslie Buck was born in Quincy, Massachusetts in 1945. By 1962, she graduated from Joseph College with her teaching degree. In April of 1979, she would marry this man here, Charles Buck, who would go by Charlie. At the time of this case, Leslie Buck was 57 years old, and she was teaching the second grade at Dean's Mills School in Stonington, Connecticut, where her and her husband lived. On May 2nd, 2002, Leslie Buck was actually kidnapped from her own garage. She would end up escaping her kidnapper, and she was able to tell police who did it. It was her husband's handyman and also friend of her husband's, Russell Kirby. Russell allegedly kidnapped Leslie for money. He was arrested and charged with it and was sentenced to 21 years in prison. Strangely enough, her husband, Charlie, would not testify against Russell at the trial. He would plead the Fifth Amendment in order to not incriminate himself. Now, the trial of Russell Kirby happened after his wife's death, because just 2 days after this kidnapping, he came home and found his wife at the bottom of a staircase, not breathing. She was dead. At this point, there were conflicting reports from coroners and medical examiners as to exactly what caused her death. The prosecution would later state that her husband Charlie strangled her to death after striking her over the head with a thick cable. But another coroner would determine something different, that Leslie actually died of myocarditis, a heart issue. But 7 years after the murder happened, and this is also after the trial of the kidnapping, Charles Buck is arrested for the murder of his wife. They discovered that Charlie was having an affair with this woman here. He had spent over $300,000 on this woman while Leslie was still alive. He helped buy her a car, a computer, a brand new bed, lavished her with clothing and money. He tried to say that she forced him to pay all of these things. She stated that this was an affair that they were having. All of this would play into his trial. But because of the conflicting reports of the cause of death, that created a massive amount of reasonable doubt. Charles Buck decided to do a judge trial, not a jury trial. There was a panel of 3 judges, and Charles Buck was found not guilty in the murder of his wife. There was not enough conclusive evidence that she was physically murdered. But man, the timing of that kidnapping, him pleading the Fifth Amendment, methinks he got away with murder. Will this over 50-year-old cold case ever get solved? Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Nick and Demetra Jeatran. Viewer discretion is advised. Nick and Demetra Jeatran lived here in this home in Clearwater, Florida. They had actually moved there from Wisconsin after they both retired because they wanted to just settle down and live out the rest of their lives peacefully. But sadly, someone did not want their lives to end very peacefully. It was Christmas Eve 1968. Friends of the Jeatrans went to their home to check up on them. When they walked in, they found the scene from a horror movie. 74-year-old Demetra and 82-year-old Nick had both been beaten to death, and there was just blood everywhere. Demetra was pronounced dead at the scene, but Nick was still alive when rescuers arrived there. However, he would later be pronounced deceased at the hospital that same day. He never recovered or opened his eyes. And to this very day, they have absolutely no idea who did this or why. There was a theory that this was a robbery gone wrong. Maybe the Jeatrans entered the home and in the middle of this robbery, and so they killed them. Or possibly they were already in the house, maybe asleep, when the robbers came in, thinking no one was there, and then they were killed. They've also had theories over the years that perhaps maybe this was over a business deal gone wrong, but police have never been able to find anything to kind of make that come true. They looked into neighbors to see if maybe any of them did this, but they couldn't pin this on anyone. Police never once zeroed in on any suspect. The murder weapon was not at the scene, and it has never been found. There is apparently really no physical evidence that they have to link to anyone. It doesn't sound like they have any fingerprints, or if they do, they haven't released it. And even if they do, it hasn't matched anyone in their system. And so what you're left with is a brutal double homicide, and nobody knows why it had to happen, and nobody knows who did this, if it was one person or two people. Detectives have stated that the evidence they do have, they have been resubmitting for potential DNA to see if they can find DNA on them. I know they said that the phone in the house was moved and there may have been like touch DNA on it, but they still haven't come up with anything. So what police are essentially relying on now is a person, maybe you. The killers or killer who did this, they may not be alive anymore, or possibly they are. They could still be in their 60s or 70s. But killers talk, and maybe they've spoken to you, or maybe they spoke to someone who then spoke to someone else. They just need someone to come forward with any information. If that person is you, please call 727-562-4080. 168 people would die in one of America's worst fire-related accidents. Hello, true crimeers. This is another Worst Freak Accidents, and this is the story of the Hartford Circus fire. Viewer discretion is advised. It was Thursday, July 6, 1944. It was a blistering hot day in Hartford, Connecticut. But the circus was in town, and so thousands of people would go to it. The Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey were in town and showing off all of their animals and their demons, and everything was going wonderfully at first. Crowds packed into the big top tent. The lion tamer wowed the audience. Then the great Walendas, who were trapeze artists, they would take the stage next. But what they didn't know at that exact moment was that disaster was about to strike. The most widely believed theory is that someone was smoking a cigarette, and then when they were done, they flicked it, which it landed on a partition by the men's bathroom. This caught fire, and because of its close proximity to the main tent, the fire quickly spread to the tent. Back then, there was waterproofing of these tents, where they used paraffin wax thinned with gasoline. So the moment that fire hit the tent, it was all over. It spread within the entire thing within moments. Thousands of people were packed into the tents and they were trying to get out. And while a good chunk of people got out, the exits were then blocked because they were trying to get the animal cages out of the tent. And so this caused people they created like a bottleneck situation, and people were stacking on top of each other trying to force their way out. They were slashing the tent with whatever instruments they could find, and they were getting out that way. Meanwhile, they had these thick pieces of tent from the top that were falling on the people inside. And eventually, the entire thing collapsed on everyone. In less than 10 minutes, this entire thing was just nothing but flames. You could see the smoke from miles away. It took them hours to get the flames out. And when they did, they uncovered so many bodies. Most of them died from exposure to the fire and to the smoke, and a lot of them were also killed by trampling or some heavy debris falling on them and crushing them, all within the tent. Approximately 168 people lost their lives, and ultimately they determined this was an accident. They actually didn't really know how it started. They just guessed that a cigarette caused it. In 1950, a man named Robert Segee, he had committed a series of arsons. And at one point, he said he started the fire. And he was actually working there that day. He actually worked for the circus company. But he confessed to deliberately starting the fire. Robert claimed that the ghostly figure of a Native American riding a flaming horse is what told him to start that fire and many other fires. He would eventually be committed to a hospital because he was diagnosed as being schizophrenic. Later on, he would recant his confession to the Hartford Circus fire, and police couldn't prove that he actually did it. They could prove that he was there that day, and he did commit other arsons after it. And so the truth is nobody really knows how this fire actually started. If this were something to have happened in today's world, we would probably be able to figure it out. But back in 1944, they didn't really have those abilities. 4 members of the Ringling brothers were actually indicted with connections to the fire. Not for committing it, but for culpability reasons. They were charged with negligence and whatnot. There was a lack of fire preparation. They didn't have any of their fire trucks near the circus. It was actually a mile away. They didn't inform the local fire departments that they were going to be performing there that day. And their fire extinguishers, which they were supposed to have, were still loaded up in crates. They never even took them out. So those 4 men would end up pleading no contest, and they served roughly a year in prison before they were actually pardoned. And in the end, 168 people at least died that day. They just wanted to have fun and watch some cool circus acts. But unfortunately, they were all consumed by fire. Eventually, $5 million would be compensated to the families of the victims. $5 million back in 1944 was a lot of money. A temporary arrest was made, but they still don't know who killed Trina. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Trina Hunt. Viewer discretion is advised. At the time of this case, Trina Hunt was a 48-year-old wife living in Port Moody, which is in British Columbia, Canada. She was married to a man named Ian Hunt. Trina was described as a happy, bubbly, bright, welcoming, caring, thoughtful, passionate, generous, and loyal person. But all of that would come to an end in January of 2021. Right smack in the middle of the COVID pandemic, when lockdowns were still going on, Trina Hunt felt bottled up, and the whole COVID restrictions thing, for many people, was really starting to get to her. On January 15th, 2021, she had been texting a friend in Ontario, and they were planning on setting up a virtual cocktail hour. On January 16th, she tried to make similar plans with a coworker, but she did not get a response right away. January 17th, that colleague will respond to her. They get a response back from Trina that said, "Sorry, delayed response because I'm trying a digital detox this weekend. Haven't touched the phone all weekend." And just the following morning after she allegedly sent that text, Trina's husband, Ian, would report her missing. Ian tells police that he had left for work that morning sometime around 6 or 6:30, and Trina was at the house. When he came home, she was gone, the door was unlocked, and so he called police. And all of her belongings were there. Her wallet, her purse, her keys, everything. The Port Moody police, they are searching high and low for her. They are combing every square inch of the area, but they don't find her. Until about 2 months later, here on the side of this road, they do discover a body. And several days after the body is discovered, it is confirmed to be that of 48-year-old Trina Hunt. And this was a homicide investigation. The only person who claims they even saw Trina the morning she disappeared was her husband. No one else saw her that entire morning. The text message that she had sent that said, "I'm going to be doing a digital detox," it seemed unusual to her friends and family. Something that just didn't sound like her. And so they thought that maybe this was sent by somebody else using her phone. Police would search the home of Trina and Ian. They also searched Ian's parents' home. And then it was announced that there was an arrest made in this case. They didn't announce the name of the person, but this is Trina and Ian's home. This is the man under arrest. It was clear that it was Ian. However, he was soon released and no charges were pressed. And now to this day, nobody has been held accountable. If you have information about the murder of Trina Hunt, please call 1-877-551-4448. Nobody saw it, nobody heard it. So where is she? Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Teresa Dean. Viewer discretion is advised. This case occurred in 1999 here in Macon, Georgia. 11-year-old Teresa Melissa Dean would walk out of her house at approximately 8 p.m. on August 15, 1999. She lived on Lawrence Drive, and she was going to be walking just down the road to a friend's house to go see their new puppies. She was observed by her family leaving the house. This is a walk she made all the time. It was literally just down the street. But Teresa never got to that friend's house. Somewhere along this road, something happened to Teresa, and nobody knows what that is. She never came home that night, and so she was reported missing that night. No sign of her, no traces of her have ever been found. They combed the area and they interviewed neighbor after neighbor. Not one single person heard anything or saw anything. If she was abducted, which is the likely case, nobody saw it happen. Or at the very least, nobody is admitting they saw it happen or heard it happen. And unfortunately, that's really all there is to this case. It went immediately cold. They searched heavily into the wooded areas. They looked for miles and miles around, but never found anything. And with no witnesses, with no evidence, there's not much they can do. I'm pretty sure they interviewed the friend whose house she was supposed to be going to, and they got nothing from that because she didn't make it there, according to everyone. I guess Teresa's mom was dating a guy, and many years down the road, that guy would be convicted of child molestation charges. That boyfriend voluntarily offered to take a polygraph test way back at the beginning of this investigation, and he failed it. He says this is because they, issued this test improperly. He has claimed that he is a suspect, but the police, oddly enough, have never named him a suspect. Nobody has been named a suspect in this case, not one person, not even a person of interest. There has been some belief that this may have connections with two other missing girls. In 2001, Shannon Nicole Polk, she vanished from Prattville, Alabama. And then in 2003, a young girl named Heaven Ross, she disappeared from Northport, Alabama. All three girls were the same age. All three girls disappeared where there was nearby construction sites, which led authorities to think maybe a construction worker did this. Shannon Polk's body was eventually found, and then in 2006, Heaven Ross's body was found. But Teresa's has not. If you have information about her whereabouts, please call 912-745-1271. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Timmy Ray Hawkins. Viewer discretion is advised. Timmy Ray Hawkins lived here in Gas City, Indiana. He was a 32-year-old divorced man who was actually still kind of living with his ex-wife, Joyce. His ex-wife's name is Joyce Hawkins. Winona Ryder's character in Stranger Things is named Joyce, and they live in Hawkins, Indiana. Random side note. Anyway, Timmy was a truck driver for a company named J.R. Schugel. On March 9th, 2004, J.R. Schugel got a satellite text message that read this. This is the exact way it was written. Mike, I sorry, but I quit. Your truck is Indiana at I-69 at exit 19 by subway, Tim. A lot of grammatical errors there, no commas. It didn't necessarily sound like Timmy. But when a police officer arrived to that kind of location, they found an abandoned truck. The window had been smashed, but inside the truck was immaculately clean. They did find one spent shell casing from what looked like a 9mm. Timmy was nowhere to be found. The truck was found off of the I-69 about 40 miles away from Gas City, Indiana. When they looked closer at the truck, there is a mattress in there because, truckers sleep in there. Part of the mattress had actually been cut out as if to hide something. But what that was, they don't know. Now, Timmy was last seen on March 8th by his family. He was in good spirits. Police learned that Timmy and Joyce had divorced about 3 years prior, but were still kind of on again, off again living with each other. Police had been called to their home on at least 3 or 4 different occasions for domestic issues. This included just before he went missing. I don't have a photo of Joyce. I can't find one anywhere. She was questioned and she initially denied anything to do with this. She's then arrested on intimidation charges for something completely different. Then she confesses. She says she accidentally shot Timmy while he was in his truck. She then dragged his body out of the truck, put it into a wheelbarrow, and then burned his body on a farm property. And that she threw the gun into a nearby river. They never found that gun. They never found anything to do with his body. His body has never been found. She said she burned it over the course of 3 to 4 days. She had written letters to televangelists stating that she was never going to get out, stating that they would never believe that this was self-defense. I don't know if Timmy Hawkins had hit her or if it was the other way around. I'm not sure. But she confessed to killing him and disposing of his body. She goes on trial and she is convicted of his murder and sentenced to 60 years. To confirm, there's no photo of her, even on the inmate records. This is the last known image of a young girl with her alleged abductor. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Relisha Rudd. Viewer discretion is advised. At the time of this story, Relisha Rudd was just 8 years old, and she was living in Washington, D.C. with her family. Due to hitting hard times and being evicted from their home, Relisha and her mother's boyfriend, and I believe a couple of Relisha's siblings were living here in this homeless shelter in Washington, D.C. Working at that homeless shelter as a janitor was this man here, 51-year-old Khalil Tatum. Well, Khalil apparently befriended 8-year-old Relisha Rudd and also was close to Relisha's family. On March 1st, 2014, Khalil Tatum would approach Relisha's mom and say, "Hey, can I take Relisha out on an outing today?" Relisha's mom said, "Yeah." Her family would never see her alive again. And it would not be until 18 days later when Relisha's mom reported her missing. Over 2 weeks worth of time where her potential abductor could have destroyed evidence, gotten rid of things. And so a manhunt began for Khalil Tatum and Relisha Rudd. That is when these images appeared on the news. This is taken from a hotel that I guess Khalil had been staying in, and this is an actual image of him holding the hand of 8-year-old Relisha Rudd, and the two of them walking down this hallway and out of the hotel. These are the last known images of Relisha Rudd. Police would then learn of a shooting here at this Red Roof Inn, which was in Prince George County, Maryland. It was there they found a woman had been shot to death. That woman was Andrea Tatum, Khalil Tatum's wife. Then, on April 1st, 2014, Khalil Tatum was found, but he would never be able to lead them to Relisha. He had put a gun to his own head and pulled the trigger and ended his own life. It's believed he shot and killed his wife because she knew what he did to Relisha. Then the coward ended his own life to never face consequences. Relisha Rudd has never been found. There has been no evidence to her whereabouts. There has been belief that Khalil put her into some kind of child or sex trafficking ring, but there's no evidence to prove that's true or no evidence to prove that it isn't true. A lot of people have placed blame on Relisha's mom, saying she's culpable of a potential murder. I guess her mom had been in trouble for child negligence in the past, and the system failed Relisha and her other siblings. Relisha's mom apparently came into a lot of money after her disappearance, but the police have cleared her mom of any wrongdoing. If you know where she is, call 202-727-9099. She was last seen walking this trail, and the question still remains, what happened to Polly? Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Thelma Pauline Melton. Viewer discretion is advised. It was September 25th, 1981, here at the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. 58-year-old Thelma Pauline Melton, who would go by Polly to everyone, was there camping with her husband and a couple of friends. In the late afternoon of September 25th, 1981, at approximately 4 p.m., Polly and her friends were hiking along the Deep Creek Trail. When all of a sudden, Polly began to speed up. She began walking really briskly and moving way ahead of her two friends. They see her basically go over this hill and then out of sight. And then Polly is never seen again. They had just assumed that Polly had gone back to their campsite where her husband was in their trailer. But when they got back to the campground at about 4:30 p.m., she wasn't there, and her husband said she hasn't gotten back here yet. So they reported her missing to the park ranger at about 6 p.m. They searched for her very, very thoroughly, and there is absolutely no traces of her ever found. Like, if she were to have fallen and went down a hill or something like that, they would have found her, especially after searching for her for a very, very long time. Polly gave absolutely no indications that she was maybe suicidal or that she was planning on picking up and leaving her life behind. All of her belongings were still in the camper. So she didn't have her ID, she didn't have her cash, she didn't have anything. She didn't take the car because her husband had the keys to the car. The only thing that seemed out of the ordinary was that on the morning of her disappearance, she would go and volunteer every day for helping provide meals to senior citizens, but this particular morning, for the first time, she did not go. Her husband thought that was very unusual. Polly had also recently lost her mother in 1981. Her mother passed away, and she was really grieving that. According to Polly's minister, he suspected that Polly was having an affair with another man, but police cannot find any proof or evidence of that. The place where she typically volunteered at the senior citizen place, well, the supervisor there said that Polly never, ever, ever used the phone there. But one day, the day prior to her disappearance, she did. And apparently it was to an unknown individual, and they never found out who it was. They don't know if it has anything to do with what happened to her or not. After searching that park as thoroughly as humanly possible, they believe that she was not there. Something else had to have happened to her. But the question is did she leave on her own accord, or did she meet with foul play? Nobody knows. If you have information about the disappearance of Polly Melton, please call 615-744-4000. If he is the one who done it, well then those answers were buried along with him. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Lori Bova. Viewer discretion is advised. At the time of this case, Lori Bova was 26 years old and she was living in Lakewood, New York. She actually worked at a Kay Jewelers alongside her sister, and she was married to this man here, Tyrone Bova. It was the evening of June 8th, 1997. Lori and Tyrone had gone to the Red Lobster in Lakewood, and that was to celebrate her sister's promotion. Her sister said that Lori seemed pretty tense at the dinner, but her and Tyrone weren't arguing or anything there at dinner. However, not too soon after the dinner, Tyrone would report Lori missing. He tells police that the two of them got into a pretty big fight just a couple of hours after the dinner, and that Lori left the house on her own accord to blow off some steam. That she took a walk around the neighborhood, but she never came home. And he allegedly looked for her, could not find her. A big red flag that Lori's family noticed almost immediately was that Lori was absolutely petrified of the dark. Even at work, when she had to take the trash out at night, she had to have someone do it with her because she was terrified of going out there alone. So the idea that she would just sort of walk the neighborhood on her own while it was nighttime, it didn't sit right with her family. Not to say that it's not something she could have done that, but it just seemed out of the ordinary. All of Lori's belongings were left at the home. She never collected any of her paychecks after she disappeared. She never used or touched her bank account after she disappeared, and her social security number has never been used in any way after she disappeared. Her husband, Tyrone, according to police, was never officially considered or labeled a suspect. However, he was a person of interest. He was kind of cooperative at first, but after a couple of weeks, he completely stopped cooperating with police. but they never found any actual evidence of foul play, so they can never arrest him or charge him or anything. They said they had other persons of interest over the years, but none of them have panned out. I guess at one point investigators found a tuft of hair in a nearby body of water they thought might have belonged to her, but it turns out it wasn't hers. They have combed the bodies of water in the area, but they've never come across anything that says she is there or was there. A couple of years back, they found skeletal remains nearby, but from what I understand, they were not identified as belonging to her. There were other missing women in the area around the same time. A few years back, Tyrone Bova passed away. If he killed Lori, which is kind of the consensus, then he took the secrets to his grave. Her family just wants to bury her. If you have information, please call 716-763-9563. In one of the oldest cold cases in Oregon's history, they still wonder who committed those murders at Little Lava Lake. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of the Lava Lake murders. Viewer discretion is advised. Pictured here is Edward Dewey Morris, Roy Wilson, and Ed Nichols. The three of them worked as fur trappers back in the early 1920s, and they were from Bend, Oregon. They planned to spend 1923 through 1924 in this log cabin doing fur trapping. By Christmas of 1923, they were all there. Ed Nichols had gone to Bend, Oregon to go into town for some things, and everyone who saw him said he was in great spirits, that the fur trapping up there was going great. On January 15th, 1924, a couple other people had gone to the cabin to visit the three men. Again, all three of them seemed to be doing really well. The trapping was going great. But when those visitors left, that was the last time anyone would ever see them alive again. This is Little Lava Lake now, obviously. So by April of 1924, it had been a really long time since anyone had heard from any of the three men. One of the men's brothers would actually go out there looking for them along with another person, and they began to search. At the cabin, they noticed that there were place settings for food for dinner. There was food that had clearly been cooked but burnt to a crisp on their oven. All of their cages they had outside with animals were now empty, and there was a bloody hammer found. By the shores of the lake, they then discovered a sled that had been covered in blood. So then the sheriff gets involved. By this time, the then frozen lake was starting to thaw out, and three bodies popped up in the water. These bodies were confirmed to be that of the three missing fur trappers. All three men had been shot through the back of their heads, and all three men had also been hit with a claw hammer. It's believed that they were likely killed towards the end of January 1924. Then a man named Charles Kimsey came up on their radar as possibly being the one to have committed this. He had sold a giant sack of animal furs for about $110. When he presented the furs, there was also a trapper's license, and it was one of the three men's trapper's license. So they put out a warrant for his arrest, but they couldn't find him. 9 years later, he's found in Montana, and now he's wanted for an attempted murder. When the sheriff's department showed his image to the guy who bought the furs, unfortunately the guy just couldn't positively say that it was him who did it. They believe he had an accomplice named Ray Jackson Van Buren, who's never been arrested for this. Years later, Charles Kimsey is convicted of that attempted murder and got life in prison, but never charged in the Lava Lake murders. It's still unsolved. One of the victims had to play dead until the killer left. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Michael Falcone. Viewer discretion is advised. Michael Falcone, pictured here with his mother, who was actually a nurse. He was born on August 4th, 1975, and he was living in New York. The 18-year-old had just started at Rockland County Community College, and he was really good friends with this gentleman here, Scott Nappi. The two of them had been friends for a long time, and the two of them, like always, were hanging out on January 3rd, 1994. They had gone to the Nanuet Mall. Their goal was to find some good radio equipment there to buy, and they had had lunch at the food court. They are then observed leaving the mall and walking towards Michael's prized possession, his 1993 Jeep Wrangler, when all of a sudden a man armed with a gun pointed the gun at them and forced them both into Michael's Jeep. It was this man here, Edward Summers, He was actually a pre-med student at South Carolina State University, and he was just in New York for the holidays. Well, he drives the Jeep to a secluded location, where he then forces both teenagers to get onto the ground with their faces in the ground. Scott says he can remember hearing the sound of a .22 firing once. He said he heard bang, and then Summers told him, "Don't look at me." Scott says he was just sitting there waiting to die. This was it. This was the end of his life. As Edward Summers points the gun in the back of his head, Scott manages to turn his head just slightly when the gun goes off. And because of that, the bullet entered his head at just the right spot that it did not kill him. But he remembers that he had to immediately realize to play dead right then and there. And he had to sit there with a gunshot to his head, pretending not to breathe, waiting for Edward Summers to leave. And finally, he did. So Edward Summers stole the Jeep. Scott managed to get up and run towards a nearby house where he called 911. Police tracked down the Jeep and they found Edward Summers driving it. They got into a high-speed pursuit, which ended in Summers crashing the car and him being captured. Michael Falcone was rushed to a hospital, the same hospital his mom worked at as a nurse, but 7 hours later he was pronounced deceased. Scott Nappi miraculously survived, and he was able to identify Edward Summers as the shooter, as were other witnesses outside the mall who saw the initial altercation. Edward Summers tried to say, "I had an accomplice, it was him who did it." They couldn't find this accomplice. All the witnesses said it was just him. He was doing really well for himself. It's crazy that he even did this. He was on his way to a great future. He was convicted and got 70 years to life. Her car broke down on the side of the road, and sadly that would lead to her murder. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Julie Heath. Viewer discretion is advised. This case occurred in Malvern, Arkansas. That is where 18-year-old Julie Heath resided. On October 11th, 1993, Julie would leave her home in Malvern, and she was going to go on her way to Hot Springs, Arkansas, to see her boyfriend. However, Julie never made it to the boyfriend's house, and Julie was never seen again. Sometime shortly after this, Julie's abandoned vehicle, and this is the actual photo of the car on the side of the road, well, it was found. But Julie was nowhere around. There didn't appear to be any signs of a struggle inside the car, outside the car. There wasn't like any blood or anything like that. So where is she? She would be reported missing and the search would begin for her. And unfortunately, that search ended on October 18th, 1993. I say unfortunately because they found her body. She was found by a hunter, and this was just off the side of a road, roughly 7 miles or so from where the car had been found. She was fully clothed, but I guess her belt was undone, and the zipper on her pants was only like halfway up, indicating that she may have been redressed by someone. Julie Heath, they determined, had been raped, and she had been stabbed to death. She also had some blunt force trauma to her head. This completely destroyed her family, and especially her mother, Nancy. Nancy had fallen into a very deep depression, and she attempted to end her own life a couple of times. And on Christmas morning, 1994, Nancy was successful this time. She was found deceased after ending her own life. She could not handle the murder of her daughter, which I don't know how any parent could. I don't know exactly what led them to this guy, but roughly a week and a half after the murder, a man named Eric Nance was arrested and charged with her murder. They found evidence in his car of Julie having been in it. They also had witness statements to show that he came into a convenience store sometime after Julie would have been killed, and he had no shirt on. He seemed to have a bunch of bruises on his body, as if someone had just got into a fight with him. He eventually admits that he killed her. He says he saw her on the side of the road because her car had broken down, and he came off to her like he was going to be someone who would help her. But then he ended up abducting her, raping her, and then stabbing her to death. He tried to say it was an accident, but the injuries on her body and the actual evidence of sexual assault said otherwise. Eric Nance was found guilty of the murder and he was sentenced to death. In November of 2005, he was executed by lethal injection. This is a case that shows that sometimes monsters can be hidden in innocence. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Kiaya Campbell. Viewer discretion is advised. Kiaya Campbell was born on August 22nd, 2006, and that was in Colorado. She was described as a beacon of benevolence and kindness to everyone. She was charismatic, full of energy, and full of life. Kiaya loved owls. She loved to collect things. She loved music. She loved dancing. In 2017, Kiaya had just graduated from the 5th grade. Unfortunately, she would not get to make it to the 6th. Kiaya lived here in this home in Thornton, Colorado with her father, and her dad had been dating a woman, and I believe she was staying there with them. The girlfriend had a 15-year-old son named Aiden Zelmer. It was June 7th, 2017. Aiden and Kiaya were supposed to be going on a walk to a nearby store, but both of them had not arrived home, and at 11:50 p.m. that night, both kids were reported missing. As they are out there searching, they finally find Aiden Zelmer walking on his own, and he appeared to be completely unharmed. He told them that he had gone to the store to steal Pokemon cards, and he had just completely lost track of Kiaya, and he has no idea where she is. There was a thunderstorm, and so they got separated, and, well, I don't know where she is. Police, they weren't buying his story, but an Amber Alert was issued the following morning for Kiaya. She was just 10 years old. It would not take long to find her. In this area, which is behind the neighborhood where they lived, and just along a very popular walking path in a large bushes, they found a body, and it was confirmed to be the body of 10-year-old Kiaya Campbell. Kiaya was partially clothed, and it was evident that she had been beaten over the head with something. Later determined that it was a metal pipe she had been struck with at least 5 or 6 times, and that is what caused her death. There was evidence that she had been dragged into the bush where she was found, and she was just thrown away like she was trash. So police would test the clothing that Aiden Zelmer was wearing the day that she went missing. They found traces of blood on his clothes. It was confirmed to be Kiaya's blood. And eventually, he tells them that he killed her. He struck her over the head 5 times with the pipe and then just threw her away. There was, I guess, some evidence to show that she may have been sexually assaulted, but there was not enough evidence to prove it. And so they don't really know if she was or not. And they don't know what the motive was either. He won't tell them. It was just incredibly random. He apparently was dealing with mental health issues, I guess. It ran in the family, but he made the adult decision to do this and then hide her body. He took a plea deal where they took sexual assault off the charges. Basically, he got 30 years to life. On May 5th, 1994, human remains were found in a backyard. But who did they belong to? Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of John and Linda Sohus. Viewer discretion is advised. San Marino, California, May 5th, 1994. In this backyard here, there were some construction workers doing some work to start putting in a pool. When they reached a certain point, they found a couple of bags. In those bags were skeletal remains of a person, but it would take quite some time to finally find out who it was. What investigators learned was that back in 1985, the previous owner of that house, Miss Ruth Dee Sohus, had reported her son John missing. By 1985, John and Linda Sohus had been married for about 2 years, and they were living at John's mother's house. Now, John was adopted. So when investigators learn all of this, they want to see if the skeletal remains belong to John, because I believe they determined that they were a male. But because he was adopted, they could not find his biological family right then and there. So they didn't have any DNA to work with. John was working in computer programming, and Linda was an artist. But then, in early 1985, Linda would tell her friend Sue that both her and John just got new jobs together. These jobs were with the United States government. But Linda couldn't tell Sue anything other than that because it was top secret. She told her friend that they had to fly to New York for about 2 weeks, and this was related to this new job. 2 weeks come and go, they're still not back home. They left on February 8th, 1985, and ever since then, they have never been confirmed seen by anyone ever again. About a week after they were supposed to be back home, Linda's sister gets a phone call from a kennel. All of the cats that John and Linda owned were still at this kennel. They had left them there for a 2-week planned trip, but they've never come to pick them up. So Linda's family goes to Dee Dee and asks, hey, have you heard from them? Have you seen them? Well, Dee Dee tells them, oh, don't worry, they're on a secret mission. And so the family just says, all right, we're going to police. And so police go to question Dee Dee, and she tells police, they're on a secret mission. I have it from a confirmed source that they're on the secret mission. When they ask who is your source, she says, I can't tell you that. But police had no evidence of foul play, and so they really couldn't go further with their investigation. 3 months after they've disappeared, Linda's friend Sue gets this exact postcard from Paris. On the back it reads, hi Sue, kinda miss New York, oops. But this can be lived with, John and Linda. At the same time, Linda's family gets this postcard. And it says, Mom, I think we need a geography lesson, but not too bad. John and Linda, or Linda and John. This looks like Linda's handwriting on both of them. This is all very strange because they were supposed to be going to New York, not Paris. Well, then a couple of months after this, Dee Dee finally files a missing persons report for John and Linda. She said that the source that she had, that they were on a secret mission, well, that source is gone now, and he's disappeared. That source was a man that she knew as Christopher Chichester. He had been living in the guest house on Dee Dee's property. So now John and Linda are missing. She has no idea where this man is, and also John's pickup truck is missing. She reported that missing too. However, they still couldn't prove any foul play, so they really couldn't go any further. In 1988, Dee Dee passes away, never knowing what happened to her son. 9 months after that, John's pickup truck is found in Greenwich, Connecticut, 3,000 miles away. A man named Christopher Crowe had attempted to sell it to someone there in Connecticut. That's when they discovered that Christopher Crowe was also Christopher Chichester, same guy. He was living at the house when the two disappeared. He says he was a source that was telling Dee Dee that the two of them were on a secret mission, and she believed it. But why was he saying all of that? It wouldn't be until May of 1994 when skeletal remains are discovered. They searched the guest house that Mr. Chichester was staying in. They used luminol, and they found evidence of blood in the guest house. Whose blood that was, though, they'll never be able to tell because it had been cleaned, and this was years later. Decades go by, and they finally track down the biological family to John Sohus. They take their DNA, create a profile, and they confirm that the skeletal remains found in the backyard of the house were that of John Sohus. This was clearly a homicide. But Linda is still missing. In 2008, they finally find Christopher Chichester, or whatever his name is. He had been telling people his name was Clark Rockefeller and telling all those people that he was a member of the Rockefeller family. He had a child down the road. He was arrested for kidnapping that child, and he was eventually convicted of kidnapping that child. He refused to cooperate with police with regards to the disappearance of Linda and the murder of John. But in 2011, he is charged with the murder of John Sohus. Apparently, his real name is Christian Karl Gerheistreiter. Well, they had the luminol evidence. They had witness testimonies about him asking people during the time frame John and Linda disappeared where he could find a place to dispose of big drums, body-sized drums. They also have evidence that he had been digging up the backyard at the time of the disappearance. The bags that John's remains were found in came from universities that he attended. In 2013, he was convicted of the murder of John Sohus. He was sentenced to 27 years to life. He refuses to say where Linda is or what he did to her. He probably forced her to write those postcards, and she was the likely target. But where is she? This is a murder case where detectives have just flat out said, we will not solve this case. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Garnet Ginn. Viewer discretion is advised. At the time of this case, Garnet Ginn was 33 years old, living in Portland, Indiana, and she taught home economics at Portland High School there in Indiana. She had been teaching for about 6 or 7 years. On the night of February 27th, 1950, Garnet would attend a sorority meeting at the Jay County Country Club, where she was seen leaving at 10 p.m. After that, nobody would see her alive again. When she did not show up to her work the following morning, and this is not something she ever did, concerned individuals would go to her home, and they also checked the garage where she parked her car, which is this building here. Inside that garage, they found Garnet dead. She was found with some kind of ligature around her neck tied to the door of her vehicle. And this was immediately ruled a suicide by the coroner. The coroner ignored the fact that her clothing had several tears on it, and also ignored the fact that there were blood spots found on and inside her car. The garage was then just sort of left there where police had trampled through it, and they allowed for, nosy neighbors to walk through it. And more unbelievably, since police and the coroner ruled this a suicide, over the years, all of the evidence they would have collected, gone. Completely missing. They no longer know where they are. All they have now are photos that were published in the newspapers at the time of this case. So this is the sewing machine belt that was wrapped around her neck. But they don't actually have this anymore. It's gone. Now, the family had her body exhumed because they did not believe this theory that she did this to herself. So when they did so, they determined that this was absolutely not a suicide. Garnet had at least 7 very severe blows to her head. She had been beaten to death, and then, post-mortem, somebody wrapped the thing around her neck and made it look like she killed herself. But for years, this case just wasn't touched, it wasn't looked at. And because they have no more physical evidence left, there's no fingerprints, there's nothing they could get DNA from, they have zilch, nada, nothing. There is no way they can solve this case. However, they do have a theory about who did it. They find out, literally decades and decades later, that Garnet Ginn may have been having an affair with the local optometrist, who was married. They believe he killed her, or his wife had her killed. The perpetrator hid in the ceiling of the garage, and then jumped down when she got inside and killed her. The optometrist and the wife, though, are both dead, and they have said they will never solve this case. There's a solid chance that this man is a killer. No shit, it's Slender Man. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of the Florence hair salon murders. Viewer discretion is advised. This case occurred in the small community of Florence, Montana. It was November 6, 2001, when a customer who was running late for their hair appointment here at the hair gallery walked inside the salon. Right in the entrance of the building, she walked into a nightmare. The shop's owner was in a pool of blood on the ground, and she was very clearly deceased. There was blood spray and spatter everywhere, but she wasn't the only victim. 2 more women were found inside of a closet. Both of them had their throats slashed. The victims were later identified as Brenda Patch, Cynthia Paulus, and Dorothy Harris. Cynthia was a customer, Dorothy was the owner of the business, and Brenda Patch was an employee. It's believed that these 2 women were killed first, and Dorothy walked in on the killer, and then he killed her. Witnesses would claim that they saw a very unusual man in the vicinity of when this happened. It was a man dressed in a long black trench coat with a fedora, and later also this composite was drawn of the man. If that's how he smiled, well, that's a smile that says, "Hi, I've murdered a lot of people." But nobody was able to identify this man, or even if he was the actual suspect. There was some bloody shoe prints left behind, and there was evidence that they were able to collect, but they never were able to link them to anyone. Police said this was a gruesome crime scene, one of the absolute worst they have ever seen. And nobody knows why these 3 women died, because nothing was really stolen. This didn't appear to be a robbery or a robbery gone wrong. It seemed that either all 3 of these women, or at least one of them, was targeted. 3 women brutally murdered in broad daylight. A few years go by and police announced they have a potential suspect, a man named Lincoln Benavides, which then linked him to his cohort, Brian Weber. Both were highly involved in drug trafficking and selling drugs in this area. They didn't exactly say what evidence linked them, but they were both charged with 3 counts of murder. However, eventually, all of the charges against them with relation to this triple homicide, all of those charges were dropped. Prosecutors stated that there just wasn't enough evidence to go forward with a trial, or even a formal indictment. It sounds like there is belief that those 2 men may be responsible, but they don't know who was the target. They investigated their families, and they investigated them. Was one of their family members someone who owed a drug debt, and then it was taken out on them when it wasn't paid? but they still need help to find out who did this. If you have information, call 406-375-4024. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Pat McRae. Viewer discretion is advised. Patrick Pat McRae was born on August 27th, 1956, and he was working as a video production coordinator for the Iowa Public Television. In 1997, Pat and his wife divorced, and this is a lot because Pat was just so busy with work that it took a toll on his marriage. He and his now ex-wife did have a couple of children, and Pat was a fantastic dad. He would do anything and everything to be with his kids. And he and his ex-wife had a pretty decent relationship still after the divorce. It was amicable. But Pat was seeking companionship ever since his divorce, and so he would spend a lot of time at an exotic dancing strip club called the Outer Limits. Pat was seen there on October 16th, 1999, but that's the last time anyone can recall seeing him. The following Monday morning, Pat was supposed to pick up his daughter to bring her to school, but he was a no-show. That was very much unlike him. So his ex-wife, who tried to get a hold of him at the house, couldn't reach him, and so she goes to the house. She has a spare key, and she opens the door, and this is a horrific scene. It appeared that there was some kind of fight in the living room. There was blood everywhere. On the counters, on the walls, on the floors. And Pat himself was just drenched in blood. He had been stabbed to death. There was blood in the bathroom that indicated that his killer cleaned up. There were bloody shoe impressions throughout the house. And more bloody shoe impressions outside the house on the patio. There was also blood in his bedroom, but only a tiny bit. There was no indication that Pat had gone to his bedroom after being stabbed. So when they took this blood and they plugged it in, they determined it actually came from a female contributor. The motive, likely robbery, because his back pocket was cut open and his wallet was stolen. Police found out where he was last seen at the Outer Limits Club, and they're told about one particular stripper there that he was talking to, and that she was suddenly a no-show. When police found her, it was not her DNA left at the crime scene, so she was ruled out. 5 years goes by when police get a call from this man here, Mars Davis. Mars tells police he knows something about a murder that happened in Des Moines, Iowa. He didn't know the victim's name, but he knew the house because he dropped a woman off at that house. A 24-year-old woman named Andrea Morris. It was Mars's girlfriend, who also worked at the Outer Limits Club. Mars said that she needed to make some extra money, and so she was supposed to be doing a private party at this house. When he picked her up later, after he got a car wash, she was covered in blood, and she said, it's from a nosebleed. But he was like, okay. She had blood in her hair, on her clothes, everywhere. So Mars and Andrea go to a hotel, and it's when Andrea realizes that she left her wallet at the house, Pat's house, and so she has Mars take her back to the house. This tracks with evidence they found because the bloody shoe impressions, there was one left that was on fresh blood, and then the other shoe impression overlapped it and was over dried blood, meaning they could tell that whoever did this came back to the house at a later time. And so Mars's story checks out. But now they don't know where Andrea is because her and Mars weren't together anymore. Well, they found out that Andrea had gotten into trouble and she spent 2 years in prison for drug charges. She was released on probation, and they called her probation officer and learned that she provided her DNA because that was part of the condition of her release. So they take that DNA and they match it with the blood they found in Pat's bedroom. It was a match. It was her blood. Her shoe size also matched the shoe impressions left at the crime scene. They finally track her down to Nebraska, where they arrest her. She says, I didn't do it. Mars actually did it. He's the killer. Except his shoe size was nowhere even close to the shoe impressions left at the house. The blood left behind at the crime scene only matched her. There was absolutely no evidence to put Mars in that house at all. So she's arrested and charged with the murder. They believe that she planned to rob the guy, and she thought of this idea of hey, Pat, I'll come to your house and give you a private show. And then she immediately just started stabbing him to steal his wallet. Mars testified against her at the trial, and he said that she claimed that they told her to do it. Meaning, she said she had voices in her head that told her to kill Pat. The jury didn't buy it, and she was convicted. She was sentenced to life in prison. That was in 2007. In 2013, she's actually ordered a new trial because it was discovered that the lawyers at her first trial, her defense attorneys, were shit-faced drunk. But before the new trial can begin, she ends up taking a plea deal and admits to what she did. She pled guilty to second-degree murder and willful injury and first-degree theft. She got 50 years for the murder, 10 years for willful injury, and 10 years for the theft. 70 total years, and she's eligible for parole after she serves 70% of that sentence. So it'll be a while. Mars was never tried or arrested or anything with any connection to this case. He did get a lot of crap from people like, why didn't you come forward sooner? Like the night of it happened. But ultimately it is what it is, and he finally came forward, and he's the reason why she's in jail now. Yeah, sure, it was years late, but at least it happened. The owl did it. The owl actually killed someone. Hello, true crimerers. This is another worst animal attacks. Viewer discretion is advised. You look like a melted marshmallow. So this story occurred in Los Banos, California. It was 1985. Unfortunately, I don't have a photo of the victim. Some passers-by noticed a big rig had been parked to the side of the road near Los Banos, and the truck was still running. A few hundred yards from the truck, they found a man lying on the ground. The man, later identified as Robert Schmidt, who was a trucker from San Jose, he was pronounced dead at the scene. Many of you will recall the story of Michael and Kathleen Peterson, the staircase case, in which there was a very pronounced theory that a barn owl attacked Kathleen. The video clip I showed at the beginning is a recreation from the HBO show The Staircase, but basically stating that the owl killed her, but not her husband. I very much still think that's complete horseshit. But in terms of Robert Schmidt, he is one of the very few people, at least officially, who has been listed as being killed by an owl. His truck had a dent in it, and what they theorize is that he may have actually struck an owl. He got out of the car to see what it was. It was nighttime when this occurred. His body was covered in what the coroner described as like chicken or talon scratches. Most of the injuries, which were very deep, were to his face and to his scalp. But he also had some very deep cuts to his chest, all that appeared to have come from some sort of talon. They were described as lacerations or tiny needle-like puncture wounds. Ugh, by the way, this owl looks like a freaking mushroom with eyes. Anyway, the coroner eventually would come to the conclusion that this was an owl attack. Some try to suggest that he may have been killed by a snake, but the injuries were not even remotely consistent with that. Mainly due to the fact that a snake doesn't have talons and can't leave scratch marks on a person. But barn owls aren't poisonous. There was a lot of blood loss, and ultimately what they came to the conclusion is that he ultimately died from shock. And not like literally like he died of fright. He died of like shock from the amount of blood loss, because he was there alone on the side of the road for probably at least a few hours. Robert Schmidt had no underlying medical issues. He was a big guy, but an owl was able to take him out. And if that doesn't terrify you enough of owls, even though it's really only happened one official time, let it be a lesson that these little demon rats, they will do it to you. They will murder you. This is why I'm terrified of these creatures. They're horrifying. The contents of this refrigerator would likely scar detectives forever. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of the Icebox murders. Viewer discretion is advised. Houston, Texas, June 23rd, 1965. Police are called to this house just to do a welfare check. A family member of Fred and Edwina Rogers had not heard from them in several days. When police arrive, they knock on the door, they get no response. They go around to the back of the house where they see a wall of flower pots that seems to have been turned into a barricade. This seemed a little suspicious to them. The back door was open, so they entered the house, calling out the names of the residents, but no one responds. They enter the kitchen, and at first nothing really seems out of the ordinary. For whatever reason, they feel prompted to open up the refrigerator, and when they do so, they find a whole bunch of what they assumed was pig meat or hog meat, kind of just stacked neatly in the fridge. But when they opened the vegetable drawer, They then realized this was not pig meat, because in that vegetable drawer were severed human heads, 2 of them. The stacked meat in the fridge were bodies that had been dismembered, later confirmed to be that of couple Fred and Edwina Rogers. It appeared their cause of death was gunshots. They had then been dismembered, and someone removed Fred's intestines and flushed them down the toilet and removed his genitals. Missing from the house was their son, Charles Rogers. The 42-year-old man lived there with them, but they had a very strange and kind of unusual relationship. He immediately became the one and only suspect in this case. Charles, who had served in World War II and then became a seismologist working in oil companies, he would reportedly only communicate with his parents by slipping notes underneath his bedroom door. Apparently, Fred and Edwina had been taking out loans in his name, and they had, I guess, allegedly robbed him of all of his savings. And according to some people, they kind of were trouble to him. Does that mean he should have shot them both, dismembered them, ripped out their intestines, and cut off one of their genitals? Probably not. They were able to recover the saw that was used. It was a wood saw, but not much else was there. It was pretty clean for the most part. Later down the road, a book would be written, and in that book, it would allege that he had been working for the CIA. The book would allege that Charles Rogers was either involved indirectly or directly with the assassination of JFK. Yep. And they theorized that his parents found out, and so he had no choice but to kill him. And his alleged CIA training, well, helped him clean up the crime scene pretty well, and helped him disappear forever. He was never found. He was declared dead in 1975. The authors of the book said he was likely murdered in Honduras, but that's never been confirmed. So this is unsolved. We know he murdered one woman, but were there more victims? Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Heather Sellars. Viewer discretion is advised. Heather Sellars was born on July 27th, 1982, and she was raised primarily in Simpsonville, South Carolina. According to her family, they did grow up pretty poor, but Heather never lacked for the things she needed. She was a good kid for the most part, but there were some behavioral type issues. She did end up dropping out of high school. She would end up actually moving to Daytona, Florida when she was 17, and she moved there and lived there for a couple of years. I guess her boyfriend out there had run into some trouble, and she eventually, I guess because of this led her into a life of taking, drugs. But in 2001, she would end up going to a treatment facility, and she got better. Then she moved back to South Carolina when all of that kind of faded, and she was living specifically in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Heather would end up getting a job at a Waffle House there, and it was there that she met this man, Jonathan Vick, and the two of them started to date. He became extremely possessive, bossy, and at times verbally and sometimes physically abusive. He and Heather's dad would come very close to throwing blows at one another. He just clearly wasn't a good guy. On September 24th, 2002, Heather would be dropped off at her job at the Waffle House. Her shift ended, and then she ended up going to her aunt's home. And then while she was at her aunt's, her boyfriend, Jonathan Vick, came over, and he picked her up. According to him, they went to a couple of bars, but her family would never see her again. She didn't show up to her work shift. She never went back to her aunt's home. She never went to her parents' home. She never picked up her paycheck. She just vanished. She was gone. And the last person to see her was her abusive boyfriend, Jonathan Vick. Heather has never been seen from or heard from ever again. And there's really been no significant updates in her case since that. Except in 1995, this woman here, Dana Satterfield, she was found murdered in her beauty salon. And that was in Roebuck, South Carolina. In 2005, DNA that was left behind on her because she was also sexually assaulted, it came up to matching this man here, Jonathan Vick. He would then be charged with the murder of Dana Satterfield in 2005, and he was convicted of her murder and sentenced to life in prison. But 6 or so years after he murdered her, he would end up starting to date Heather Sellars, and then she goes missing. Another coworker of theirs at the Waffle House, Michelle Whitaker, also disappeared. That was in 2002. However, she was eventually found safe and alive in 2008. She left on her own accord. It is widely believed that Jonathan Vick murdered Heather Sellars, but her body has never been found and he is not admitting to anything, leaving the case of Heather Sellars unsolved. An elevator shaft would lead to one of the worst deaths imaginable. Viewer discretion is advised. This story happened here in Quezon City in the Philippines, specifically here at Cyberpark Tower number 1. In March of 2019, a 37-year-old man named Michael Alfonso was using the gym located on the 3rd floor with a friend of his. Michael, before leaving the building, needed to use the restroom. This is the actual door in question here. According to the friend, Michael assumed or thought this was the door to the bathroom. There was no signage on this door whatsoever. This is actually what it looked like. The door was unlocked, so Michael opens it and he steps in. What he did not realize was that door was actually an emergency service door for the elevator. And when he stepped in, it was an immediate free fall. Michael Alfonso fell 3 stories down to the cement ground of the basement of the building. His friend would immediately contact security, who would then call an ambulance. Michael was rushed to the hospital where he was still alive on the ride there, but sadly by the time Michael Alfonso got to the hospital, he would be pronounced dead on arrival. Michael had landed on his head and arm, and he sustained some very severe injuries to his skull and one of his arms. I know at one point they actually investigated this from the perspective of a potential foul play homicide, but from what I can tell, they were not able to gather any evidence to prove that. The building owners got into some serious issues, though, because there was absolutely no warnings on this door whatsoever. And also, why was the door just unlocked? Now, to be fair, it also didn't have any kind of bathroom door indications either. But I have to imagine that at this point, that door is now locked always, and I hope they have put warning signs all over this thing. I can't imagine, falling to me, you know how it makes your stomach drop? I can't imagine just opening a door and then taking a step in, thinking there's a floor there, and then there's just not. And experiencing that stomach-dropping, just horrific feeling when you aren't anticipating it. I mean, that just had to be horrifying. Because he didn't even die when he hit the ground. I mean, he died at the hospital. That fall probably only took literally just moments or seconds. But I have to imagine that it probably felt like it was an hour. I just can't imagine the shock and the fear and all of it. And then also the pain of just landing on the cement ground. Just an insanely unfortunate incident all the way around. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Elizabeth and Cheri. Viewer discretion is advised. 20-year-old Elizabeth Vasser was originally living in the Nashville, Tennessee area. At some point around that time, she gave birth to a little girl who she named Cheri. Her name was Cheri Barnes. But then Elizabeth met a man named Larry Vasser, whose photo, unfortunately, I cannot find. Larry Vasser was a career criminal. He had actually just recently gotten paroled for armed robbery. Right after he was paroled, he met her, and they got married in 1985. Larry would very quickly turn her into prostitution, and he became very aggressive and very demanding of her. Her family says that Larry had this incredible power over her, that he controlled her almost as if it was mind control. That's how bad it was. She got arrested for prostitution one time, and he didn't do anything about it. At one point, according to her family, Elizabeth had to beg her family for $6,000 in cash, or else Larry would hurt her or kill her. Then, in October of 1986, Larry would move Elizabeth and Cheri to St. Louis, Missouri, where, once again, he forced Elizabeth into prostitution. On December 1st, 1986, Elizabeth Vasser just up and vanished. According to Larry, she left on her own accord. A few weeks after she disappeared, Cheri disappeared, along with Larry. It took some time for Elizabeth's family to kind of realize what was going on and to finally report her missing. And police were like, there's not much we can do because she was a full-grown woman who left on her own accord. 2 months after Elizabeth disappeared, in February of 1987, a body is pulled from the Mississippi River near the Interstate 270 bridge. It took some time after this for them to link everything together and identify that body. It was Elizabeth Vasser, and this was a homicide. Now, at this point, Larry Vasser has been reconvicted of another armed robbery, and he tells police that Cheri is safe and sound with his family, she has a new name, and she probably doesn't even know she's missing. Police interviewed him in prison, and he says he had nothing to do with her murder, and he did not kidnap or hurt Cheri. But he absolutely refuses to say where she is. According to a probation officer of Larry's, he actually told the probation officer that his ex-wife, Elizabeth, had been strangled to death before she was found. So that was kind of strange, considering he kept saying that he had nothing to do with her murder and that she just left on her own. Police track down as many family members as they can of Larry's, and they have never been able to find Cheri, or any sign of her ever being with them. In August of 1989, a blue suitcase was found with a small skeleton inside. They were able to determine the age, race, and sex. This was a biracial individual. They also superimposed Cheri's face over these remains, and it was a presumptive match of Cheri. However, they have not been able to actually pull any DNA from these skeletal remains, so they do not have a definitive answer as like, this is her remains. They also don't have dental records to confirm either. They can only say that they are fairly certain that the remains found in that suitcase were hers. According to some family members, they actually recognized the blue suitcase these remains were found in. It belonged to a collection of suitcases that seemed to go missing around the same time Cheri and Elizabeth disappeared. Again, they can't say for 100% certainty, but they feel pretty confident that that was Cheri. Larry Vasser has never been charged with connection to either of these cases. They just don't have the physical evidence to link him directly to them. And they can't, like I said, 100% say for certainty that Cheri is dead, but they are pretty close to sure. If you have any information with regards to this case for either victim or both, please call 270-782-2010. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Jimmy Rice. Viewer discretion is advised. At the time of this case, Jimmy Rice, pictured here with his family, was just 9 years old and lived in Redland, Florida. On September 11th, 1995, which was just a couple of weeks before his 10th birthday, Jimmy had gone to school, and then at the end of the day, he got on the bus. The bus dropped him off at his neighborhood, and the walk from the bus stop to his house was literally a block away. Jimmy never made it home. By that late afternoon, his family would report him missing because they couldn't find him anywhere. They confirmed he was on the bus and he got off the bus, but no one saw him after that. What could have possibly happened in that less than 1 block walk? Well, it turns out a lot. As the search for Jimmy is going on, a woman named Susan Shinehouse would go to police. And this was a couple of months after he disappeared. So on December 5th, 1995, she tells police that she found belongings to Jimmy Rice inside this trailer on her property. The man who lived in that trailer was the family's handyman, a man named Juan Carlos Chavez. 2 days after this, police tracked him down and brought him in and arrested him. And he confessed. Jimmy Rice will never come home. Jimmy Rice was dead. A detective here is pointing out the exact location where Jimmy was abducted. According to Juan, he took his truck and he blocked Jimmy from going any further and forced Jimmy into his car. He then brought Jimmy Rice back to the trailer he lived in, where he would then sexually assault him. And within hours of everyone looking for Jimmy, there was helicopters flying above. 9-year-old Jimmy tried to escape at that point. But Juan Carlos Chavez had a gun in his hand and he shot Jimmy in the back. And he sat there with Jimmy in his arms and watched him die. He then removed Jimmy's head and he disposed of the body. After his confession, he would lead police to Jimmy's body. They also found other pieces of evidence in areas where Juan said evidence would be to confirm it was him who did this. He was arrested, obviously, and he was charged with capital murder. He tried to say that because he was sexually assaulted as a child, it's why he liked to sexualize little boys. The truth is, he's just an evil piece of shit who took a 9-year-old boy away from his family, from his friends, from everyone. Jimmy will never get to grow up. Jimmy will never get to graduate high school, get married, have kids, have grandkids. All of that was stolen from the world by this monster. He was convicted and he was sentenced to death. On February 12, 2014, at 8:17 p.m., Juan Carlos Chavez was executed, and Jimmy got his justice. In the early morning hours of June 24, 2000, a teenage girl was seen getting into a car of a stranger. Her family would never see her alive again. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Trisha Autry. Viewer discretion is advised. Trisha was born on December 12, 1984, and she was one of, I believe, 3 siblings. Or I know she had 2 sisters for sure. Trisha was described as someone who grew up always wanting like a best friend, but she never really had one. She never really had like that super close friend that she could confide in, and that's just something she always longed for. In this recreation from Unsolved Mysteries, Trisha would spend hours and hours on her computer writing stories. She loved doing it. To her family, I guess this was kind of like her way of just sort of letting things out by writing. It was very early morning, June 24th, 2000. Her sister Brianna would actually be in the living room, and she observed Trisha on the computer typing away. This was at 2:30 a.m. She would then get up and go back to her room while Trisha continued to type away. However, by 6 a.m., just a few hours later, when her mom woke up, Trisha was nowhere to be found. When her mom looked at the computer and turned it on, there was no stories on there, and she couldn't figure out what Trisha was doing for several hours that morning. After searching the neighborhood and calling some people, they reported her missing. They would have a computer guy analyze the computer, and they determined that at 3 a.m. the morning she disappeared, there was a whole bunch of files deleted from that computer. They also found out that Trisha had at least 3 different email addresses, and she was frequenting chat rooms, like a lot of us did in the early 2000s. So there became this immediate fear that did she meet someone on the internet and then meet them in person, and then God knows what happened. A neighbor would come forward to state that a few days before she disappeared, the neighbors saw Trisha getting out of some red car and kind of sneaking back into the house. Then, on the morning that she disappeared, another neighbor woke up around 4 o'clock because there was a sound of a car driving by and the headlights flashed into their room. When the neighbor looked outside, they saw a red car with a man on the outside and a girl who looked just like Trisha getting into it. According to another witness, about 2 hours after that sighting, Trisha was spotted in a convenience store by a clerk who worked there. This clerk recognized Trisha because she had seen her in there before. The clerk said it looked like Trisha was alone, but she was like pacing back and forth, looking out the window as if she was looking for someone. But then after about 20 or so minutes, Trisha didn't buy anything. She walked out of the store, and that was the last time that anybody would report seeing Trisha Autry ever again. They never found any evidence of who she may have been talking to on the internet, or even if she was. They also never found out who was driving that red car, or if it was even related to this. So Trisha's case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, but as they're filming it, this is now roughly 5 or 6 months after she disappeared, a humongous break in the case happens. And it's a very unfortunate one. Oh, marshmallow tits. Oh, sorry. It's just quite a fright. This man, Cody Len Nielsen, came up on police's radar. He worked on a wildlife facility roughly 8 miles away from where Trisha lived. Several witnesses would come forward to state that he was on the wildlife preserve, specifically in this area, with a backhoe and digging up big holes and then filling them back in for no apparent reason. So when police got these tips, they would bring in some cadaver dogs who picked up on this area of that field where there was a very obvious hit. They dug roughly 10 feet into the earth and they found a human jawbone. They then found other locations where the dog hit just nearby this one. They dug some more. They found more human remains and the clothing that Trisha had last been seen in. The jawbone and the remains were identified as belonging to 16-year-old Trisha. Cody Nielsen was never really initially on police's radar, but they found out that he was kind of connected to Trisha. A friend of Trisha's came forward to state that this man had approached her and Trisha one day while in his truck. Well, this friend ended up getting into the truck and he took her to that wildlife preserve where he worked and he raped her. And then I guess another day he came across them again and he gave Trisha his pager. The friend identified him as this man who raped her and also just that Trisha knew him. So he was arrested and he was charged with the kidnapping and murder of Trisha Autry. He denied he had anything to do with it. At his trial, Trisha's friend and then 4 other women would testify how he had raped them. All in very similar fashion, picked him up in his truck, and yeah. And of course, not to mention the fact that Trisha's body was found on where he worked, and where people, in the exact spot, people observed him digging up a hole and then filling that hole back in. They said without a doubt it was him doing it. So in January of 2004, he was convicted of the kidnapping and murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. And in the end, it turned out it had nothing to do with this computer stuff and chat rooms. He didn't own the red car, so I don't know what those sightings were about. She may have gotten into that car and was dropped off at the convenience store, maybe. And then that's when Cody Nielsen found her and picked her up. And the red car person has never come forward, so it could be completely unrelated, but still have happened. But thankfully, Trisha Autry got the justice she rightfully deserved. There would be a conviction, but Bob is still out there somewhere. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Robert Wykel. Viewer discretion is advised. Robert James Wykel, who would go by Bob to everyone, he was born on May 18th, 1930 in Cook County, Illinois. Bob was described as someone who always had a very positive outlook on life. He treated every single person he met with kindness and respect. He loved taking adventures. He loved to travel. Eventually, he would marry. They would have a girl named Rebecca. But at some point, he and his wife would divorce, but they stayed pretty friendly with one another. Bob also loved to restore old cars. And by the age of 66, he now was a grandfather, and he was planning to restore some vehicles with his grandson. Something he was really looking forward to, but unfortunately, he never got the opportunity. At this point, Bob was actually living in King County, Washington, and it was February 21st, 1996. That's the last time anyone in his circle would ever see him again. He told his friends and family that he was going to be out of town because he was going to be purchasing a 1961 Ford Thunderbird. His plan eventually was to restore that car. Whenever he was about to make a purchase like this, he always carried it in cash, so they believe he had probably about $5,000 in cash on him. Bob's 1989 Mercedes-Benz convertible was actually found on March 11th, 1996. The car was found in Burien, Washington. Once the family and friends found out about this, they would report him missing because they couldn't get a hold of him by phone, they hadn't seen him, no idea where he is. Police check his home. All of his suitcases were there, empty. If he's traveling, he always would bring at least one with him. All of his clothes were still in the house. All of his belongings were still there. He had opened food in the kitchen that had begun to rot. He had a pot of coffee still half full. There was also a glass of wine found with some wine left in it. What all of this showed to police was that Bob Wykel fully intended to be back home very soon after he left to purchase this car. Fast forwarding now to 2009. This man here, Myron Wynn, an acquaintance of Bob Wykel's, was arrested and charged with connections to the murder. Even though Bob has not been found at that point, as a matter of fact, he hasn't been found even to this day. Police found out in their investigation that he was actually the last person to see Bob, because it was him who told Bob about the Ford Thunderbird, and that he had gone with Bob to go get it. Now, police knew about him back in the day, and they actually said, hey, will you take a lie detector test? And every time he said, yeah, I'll do it. But every time he never showed up. Then, out of nowhere, he picks up and he moves to Texas. Yeehaw. Then police discovered that in 1996, shortly after Bob's disappearance, this man here gives his girlfriend a diamond ring. He says he found this diamond ring in a parking lot. What parking lot was that? Just so happens to be the same parking lot that Bob Wykel's car was found. That diamond would be passed around by like a couple people within his family, and police were actually able to get that diamond back. The family of Bob confirmed that that was definitely his diamond because he always wore that diamond ring. There were a lot of like nicks and cuts on the diamond, and they said, yeah, definitely that's his because he never took it off, even when he worked or worked on cars. So they believe that Myron Wynn deliberately lured Bob away, knowing full well he usually carries a bunch of cash on him. And they actually confirm that the plan to show this car must have backfired on him because Myron would end up taking Bob to his family member's house. The family member of Myron said, yeah, I remember seeing a guy who looked just like Bob here at the house on February 23rd, so 2 days after he was last seen by his friends. Well, this just so happens to be the property, this is only part of it, by the way, it's actually much larger than this, where Myron's family member lived, where he took Bob. And once Bob and Myron left the house one day, that was the last time anybody ever saw Bob again. Police believe that he was lured to this location and he was likely killed somewhere in this area for that cash, because when his car was found, his wallet was in it, but it was empty. And they know money was stolen from it for sure, not to mention the diamond ring. However, they have never found any signs of Bob or Bob's remains here anywhere on this property. In December of 2010, Myron Wynn goes on trial and it ends in a mistrial. Then they retry him again in 2011. This time, they're able to convict him. He is convicted of murder, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Likely one of the reasons for the light sentence is because Bob hasn't been found. So I guess you could say there is not definitive proof that he is dead, even though everyone knows he pretty much is. But Bob is still out there somewhere. He's probably in a hole somewhere, a lonely hole out in a field. And his killer won't say a damn thing about where he is. And he never will, because he thinks he could probably get more time for it, I'm sure. You would think someone would just say, all right, you got me, there's where the body is, give him back to his family, but monsters always be monstering. 55 years ago, a teenage girl was killed, and they are still looking for the answers. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Mary Kay Heese. Viewer discretion is advised. This case happened in Wahoo, Nebraska. I guess it's like the home of David Letterman's top 10 list or something. Mary Kay Heese was a 17-year-old junior at Wahoo High School, and she had gone to school on March 25th, 1969. After school, she was seen here at the corner of 5th Street and Linden Street in Wahoo, a town of like 3,000 people at the time. Witnesses said they saw the teenage girl eating an apple and she had textbooks in her arms. But this is the last place that anyone could recall seeing her alive again. By that late evening, her parents would report her missing because she never came home. The following morning, about 4 miles away from where she was last seen, near a farm in Wahoo, a farmer found these textbooks that were scattered across the road. And then he called police because he heard about the missing girl who was last seen carrying textbooks. When police arrived, they searched the area and they find a body in a ditch. Very quickly confirmed to be that of Mary Kay Heese. She had been stabbed 17 times. She was fully clothed. The only thing she didn't have on her was her shoes, but her shoes were found just a few feet away. The murder weapon, the knife, they believed was a knife, was never found. It wasn't anywhere at the crime scene. The coroner would determine that there were signs of a struggle on her body, indicating that she tried to run away and she also fought back. There were shoe impressions left by her body that they determined were likely left by her killer. There was also hair found at the crime scene that was not Mary's, and they believe that this was her killer's. From what I can tell, they put together a list of roughly 15 suspects, 14 of them men, one of them was a woman. They said the primary suspect was eventually ruled out and cleared, and then their secondary suspect had ended his own life 2 years after her murder. But the names on that list of suspects and their top 2 suspects, they have not announced those names publicly. They are hoping, well, they had been hoping at one point that DNA would help them solve this. This article was about 35 years after the murder. It's now been 55 years since. And they did collect a lot of evidence that did contain DNA that wasn't Mary's, but to this day, that DNA has never matched anyone, including their top 2 suspects. They've been able to take DNA from like family members and whatnot of suspects, and they've all been cleared. And still, nobody knows who did this. If you have information, please call 402-443-4155. A young couple found murdered in the woods, and they are still wondering who did it. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Donna Hall and Michael Margaret. Viewer discretion is advised. Donna and Michael, even though they had gone to separate high schools, they were high school sweethearts, and they lived in Henrico, Virginia. Donna was considered vivacious, she was kind, she was caring, and she had a lovely smile. Michael loved being active, he loved being outdoors, he liked to go hunting and fishing. And by all accounts, everyone said this was just such a good couple that you could absolutely see them getting married down the road and having a family. But if that were to be a possibility, it was all taken away from them. On August 21st, 1984, in this wooded area in Henrico off Patterson Road, a Jeep was discovered and the passenger side door was open. When they walked farther into the woods, they found 2 people, both dead. Both individuals had been stabbed and their throats had been cut. The detectives would later describe this absolutely as overkill. Eventually, they would determine that these were the bodies of 21-year-old Michael Margaret and 18-year-old Donna Hall. Based on their decomposition, it appeared they had been dead for at least 3 or 4 days. And police would confirm this when they discovered the last time anyone saw them was on the night of August 17th, 1984. They had been at some very small, intimate house gathering with friends. They left that house around 11:45 p.m., and it was just the 2 of them that left. The friends at the party have always been extremely cooperative with police. But after leaving, police do not know where the couple had gone to. Some details about the crime scene: the keys were in the ignition, but the car was off. Donna's shoes were not found at the crime scene, so they don't know if they were stolen or if maybe she took her shoes off at a different location. But police can confirm that the 2 of them were killed here where they were found. Donna was actually clutching pine needles. That's how they know they were killed there. Another piece of evidence they found was a pack of cigarettes, but it doesn't sound like they know if it belongs to the 2 of them or maybe their killer. It had rained very heavily in the nights between when they were last seen and when they were found, so a lot of evidence that could have been maybe collected was washed away. The coroner determined that the couple was killed sometime between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning on that August 18th morning. According to their toxicology reports, both of them had high levels of Demerol in their system. They don't know if they took that willingly or if it was slipped to them. Maybe it could have been used to subdue them. Police do believe that this is likely drug-related, maybe a sale gone wrong, or maybe someone owed money. If you have information, please call 804-501-5276. A spree killer was... Oh, hey, fellas. Good talk. A spree killer was inspired by Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Daniel Gonzalez. Viewer discretion is advised. This case occurred in England. Daniel Gonzalez grew up apparently a very smart young man. He was really good at chess, but he was also troubled with a very dark mind. He was very clearly demonstrating some severe mental health issues. His mother had tried to get him help, tried to get him committed, but these hospitals wouldn't do anything. She even made a statement once by saying, "What does he have to do? Murder someone to get help?" Little did she know that's basically what happened. Daniel Gonzalez would state that he was very much inspired by Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees, well known in the slasher movie world, and he wanted to be serial killers just like them. He also said he was inspired by the Columbine shooters. On September 15th, 2004, he would literally put on a hockey mask, just like Jason, and he attempted to stab an elderly man named Peter King, but Peter King got away. But Daniel Gonzalez then came across a 76-year-old woman. Her name was Marie Hartung, and wearing that hockey mask, he stabbed her to death. 2 days later, September 17th, 2004, he stabs and kills a 46-year-old man named Kevin Malloy. He did so with several knives that he had stolen from a store. He then attempted to kill another random man, a man named Kumis Constantino. He stabbed him, but the man would live. And this is the knife he would use. Next, he breaks into the home of Derek and Jean Robinson, and he stabbed the elderly couple in their home, killing both of them. He would later go on to say that it was orgasmic when he killed them. Daniel would then write letters to himself as like an alter ego named Zippy, and he said how happy the murders made him feel. He was ecstatic over it. He was actually soon apprehended, and he was charged with these murders. He tried to say he was not guilty based on, insanity, but the courts rejected that. He was found guilty of all the murders, and the judge recommended he get life in prison, and he said that he hoped he would never, ever be free again. Well, in 2007, while in prison, he tried to eat himself. He literally bit into his own body and tried to, eat the veins out of him. And this failed at killing him. But then on August 9th, 2007, I guess using a broken CD case that he had in the prison, he managed to end his own life with those cut pieces. He was 26 years old. He murdered 4 people and then himself. And one just has to think that if those doctors and hospitals took all of this seriously and treated him, would any of this have turned out differently? I guess we will never know. They were both killed with a butter knife, and it would take 42 years to find out that the answers were closest to home. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Karen and Gordon Alexander. Viewer discretion is advised. 14-year-old Karen and 13-year-old Gordon lived here in this home with their mother and father, and this is in Texarkana, Arkansas. It was April 8th, 1981 at 7:15 a.m. Karen and Gordon's mom was actually hospitalized at the time, and so it was just their dad with them at the house. However, he worked overnights, and when he came home at 7:15 a.m. that day, their father, Weldon Alexander, found both of his children stabbed. There was a butter knife sticking out of one of them. It was a butter knife that looked similar to this. He said he took the knife out and he placed it on the dresser. Weldon calls police, they arrive, and sadly 13-year-old Gordon is pronounced dead at the scene. 14-year-old Karen, however, was still alive but unconscious. She was rushed to the hospital where she would spend the next 2 to 3 days or so in a coma, where eventually she died from her injuries. Both children were stabbed to death with that butter knife, which is unusual. I don't think I've ever heard of a butter knife being used as a murder weapon. So it sounded to police as if it was almost like I just got to grab something and do this. Karen was also sexually assaulted, and they found male bodily fluid on her sheets next to her body. They collected that DNA and stored it, but back in the early 80s, they didn't have the technology yet to find out who it was. They also took their fingernail clippings from both children and they scraped on the inside. But again, back then, they couldn't do much with it, but they stored it. At one of Icadabra! God, I hate this guy. Always popping up places. At one point, Henry Lee Lucas confessed to the murder of the 2 children, because the psychopath confessed to every murder ever committed because he was just a sad, scary, bored man. Well, they would confirm that it was not actually him who did it. And so the murder of the 2 children went cold, and then it stayed cold for decades. 42 years later, they finally have a break in the case. The fingernail clippings they scraped, they were able to now build a DNA profile. There was DNA from the same contributor underneath both of their fingernails. That DNA profile matched the male bodily fluid found next to Karen. So it appeared that both children scratched the same attacker who also raped Karen. That DNA matched one person, their own father, Weldon Alexander. It was a 100% match. They believe that he raped Karen and his son tried to stop him, and so he killed them both. He would never face justice because he died in 2014. This is the last known image of a woman and her dog just minutes before they were both brutally murdered. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Katie Jeunesse. Viewer discretion is advised. At the time of this case, Katie Jeunesse was 40 years old and she was living in Atlanta, Georgia, and she was dating this woman here, Emma. At the time of this case, Katie was a bartender at an Italian restaurant, and she also worked at the Whole World Improv Theater. Katie was an avid reader and book collector. She had recently taught herself how to play the guitar, and she was just starting to write her own songs. Katie was also a wonderful, loving dog mom. She and her partner Emma had a 3-year-old dog named Bowie. Katie and Bowie were close. She absolutely adored Bowie. It was July 28th, 2021. Katie had gone out of her apartment that night to take Bowie on their evening walk. They both never came home. This is an image taken just minutes before this horrible crime occurred, and this was, I guess, just outside of Piedmont Park in Atlanta, Georgia. When Katie's girlfriend Emma realized that they hadn't come home yet and they should have been home, she would go walk herself down to Piedmont Park, and she made a horrific discovery there just at the entrance. Katie and Bowie were both dead. Both had been stabbed to death. Katie received around 50 different stab wounds to her face, her neck, and her torso. Her killer carved the word fat into her torso, and 15 of those stabs were directly to her head. She also had blunt force injuries to her head. This was done by a very angry person, a very sick person. And Katie and Bowie's murder or murderers have not been caught. Piedmont Park had 9 cameras there, but not one of them was actually working. They are really just there for show, to scare people from doing bad things. But there are cameras outside the park, and they caught a jogger and 3 people walking across a crosswalk, a man walking with a cane, and then someone else walking alongside the park. None of these people are suspects, but they all may have been potential witnesses because all the images I just showed were from the time when this murder likely happened, which was close to midnight or 1 a.m. Someone had to have heard or seen something. A woman and a dog don't get stabbed 50, 60 times and nobody hears anything or sees anything. That's insane. I know they tested Bowie to see if maybe he had bit the attacker and have checked for DNA, but police have really not released anything. There are no suspects. If you have information, please call 404-614-6544. These are 3 deaths that occurred at Kings Island. Viewer discretion is advised. Don't mind the scratch on my head. You should see the other guy. The other guy's nail that was sticking out of a wall that I stupidly walked into. Anyway, Kings Island is a theme park located in Ohio. I've covered a few other deaths that occurred at this theme park. It seems to be popular. On July 24th, 1976, at Kings Island's Lion Country Safari, a 20-year-old ranger named John McCann got out of his vehicle and was immediately mauled to death by a lion. Actually, I believe it was several lions that mauled him to death. Maybe the lions should be out in their natural habitats. I don't know. This is the International Street Fountain, which has a depth of 2 feet. On July 26, 1986, a 26-year-old man named Mark Beckham decided to get atop of a 13-foot-high platform and dive headfirst into the 2 feet of water. He landed on his head and he snapped his neck. Unbelievably, he survived and was rushed to the hospital, but by August 2nd, 1986, he passed away from his injuries. The third incident happened on August 5th, 1989, and this was just Mother Nature being crazy. A 39-year-old employee named Thomas Cahill, who worked at the park, he was walking to the parking lot when suddenly he was struck by a bolt of lightning. He was killed instantly. This one was just a complete freak accident and was nobody's fault. I covered this one before, but I guess I'll just say it again. This is the Eiffel Tower replica there on May 13th, 1983, and I think this is where the legend of Tower Johnny came from. A 17-year-old kid named John Harder decided to climb the inner workings of the tower, where he lost his footing and he fell a long distance to the top of the elevator, and he was killed instantly. It's said his ghost now haunts the Eiffel Tower replica, and they call him Tower Johnny. This is the aftermath of one of Canada's deadliest subway accidents. This is Worst Freak Accidents. Viewer discretion is advised. It was 1995 in Toronto, Canada. On August 11th, 1995, many people would be boarding the subway systems on their way home from work. But at 6:02 p.m. that night, a disaster took place. Robert Jeffrey had just started working as a driver for the subways, literally 2 days before this. And I guess due to his inexperience or poor training, I'm not sure, he actually ends up running 3 straight red light signals. And because there is also a train stop feature that is supposed to start the brakes of the subways if someone accidentally runs the red light signals, well, this particular system also failed. So what happened is that there was a stationary subway on the track when the driver of the other one who ran the 3 red light signals ended up crashing into the back of the other subway, which completely obliterated the back end of that subway and the front end of the other. There were roughly 300 or so passengers aboard, each train combined. In the end, people who witnessed this said the subway tunnel looked like a war scene from a movie. There was just metal just everywhere, filling up the entire tunnel. There was smoke billowing. There was immediate and instant panic and chaos. It took them hours to be able to rescue everybody from the wreckage. There had been people caught up in tangled up pieces of metal. And most of these people, unbelievably, would end up surviving. 30 or 40 of these people were hospitalized for their injuries because they were severe enough, but those 30 people would end up surviving. 100 other people would have minor injuries, but sadly, 3 people were pronounced dead at the scene of the incident. Christina Munar Reyes, Kinga Jabo, and Jean Hui Lin. All 3 had been killed instantly. The driver that caused this actually ended up surviving and not really having that many injuries. There were, I think, 3 or 4 employees of the subway system who were hospitalized, but they ended up being okay. They found out that I guess the day prior, on his first day, the driver also ran another red light. However, they, I guess, linked this to just poor training and inexperience. And he was not charged with any crimes related to this. I know he was put on medical leave, and then the February after the incident took place, he had been released from his job, that they said was unrelated to the incident. Many changes have since been made to protect the safety of passengers. She was found 40 years ago, and still nobody has identified her. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of the Vernon County Jane Doe. Viewer discretion is advised. It was May 4th, 1984. Here on Old Line Road, just outside of the town of Westby, Wisconsin, 3 teenagers would stumble across a body found just dumped on the side of the road. The coroner would determine that this individual was a woman between the ages of 50 and 65. She had graying brown hair. She was approximately 5'5", about 150 pounds. She also had worn dentures. There were dentures found next to her body. These are all of the clothing items that she was wearing when she was found. They would determine that she died of likely blunt force trauma to her head. Based on witness statements, they determined she had only been there for a very short amount of time, but they have not publicly said when she exactly died. When they initially put all of this information out, they did get a lot of tips and a lot of people saying, this might be them, this might be this person, but ultimately none of those tips have ever panned out. This was a woman who was murdered and then just dumped like she was garbage. The Vernon County Sheriff's Department is asking for the public's help, even still to this day, 1, to identify her, and 2, to find out who did this to her. You can actually publicly see the morgue photo of her actual, face. I obviously can't show that here on TikTok. But even with that actual image of her face being very public, still nobody has said they know who she is. Based on pollen evidence they found on her body, they are speculating that she may have possibly come from either Arizona, maybe New Mexico. They have exhumed her body a couple of times over the years to get DNA and stuff like that. They have worked with the DNA Doe project, and they are currently working with a forensic genealogy location, but still they have not announced, at least publicly, if they have gotten any further with this or if they've connected to any family. The genealogy thing and like the Ancestry.com thing isn't always going to work. It still depends on many factors for that to actually come to a conclusion. But there is still hope that that can very much work here. She was somebody's family member. She could have been a mom. She may have been a grandma. She could have been an aunt. She may be a sister. She was a daughter to someone. It's unbelievable that nobody knows who she is, even still. If you have any information, please call the Vernon County Sheriff's Department at 608-637-2123. Was he truly a concerned husband, or did he kill her? Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Doreen Marfio. Viewer discretion is advised. Doreen Dobson met Stephen Marfio in 1976, and within 2 years, they were married. And eventually, they would move into this home in Johnston, Rhode Island. They were described as an absolute perfect match. Both of them were very full of life. Doreen was a very vivacious woman, incredibly outgoing. She was always making people laugh. The two of them had a very active lifestyle. They were very outdoorsy people. And by all accounts, they had a pretty decent, normal marriage, at least from the outside looking in. But on the afternoon of March 29th, 1990, all of that would change forever. Stephen would come home that day and discover that his wife, Doreen, was gone. Her car was in the driveway, but there was a suitcase missing. There were some clothing items of Doreen's missing. There was, according to Stephen, $600 missing from their safe. But then Doreen also left behind all of her, toiletries, and also her beloved cats. She left no notes, there were no messages on the answering machine, and she did not talk to anyone prior to this and gave nobody any notice that she planned on just leaving. Doreen was just gone. However, Stephen waited 2 days to report her missing. When police questioned him about that, he said that she had been very emotional lately, that she was kind of on this verge of a nervous breakdown, it seemed like. She had just recently up and left her job with absolutely no reason for doing so. And her behavior, he said, was just becoming more erratic, and she seemed to be becoming an emotional wreck. So he said he didn't report her missing for 2 days because he just assumed she packed a small suitcase and was just going to blow off some steam for a couple of days. However, when police looked into it, she had never touched her bank account ever since March 29th, 1990, the day she disappeared. And from that day moving forward, her social security number has never been used. There have been some sightings of her, I guess a couple of times, but none of those were ever confirmed. The reality is since that March 29th, 1990 day, no one had seen her or heard from her ever again. Now, the husband, Stephen, he was very, very involved in trying to find her. He actually would spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars pouring out all this money in these efforts to try to locate his wife. He himself spent money advertising her disappearance in the newspaper. He would go on the news willingly and share her story. You know, usually if a guy kills his wife, he's not going to be so public about trying to draw attention to it. Then police were notified by Stephen himself shortly into the investigation of something pretty remarkable. He admitted to police that for the course of about a year, he hired a private investigator to follow Doreen around. Now, he says he was doing it for her, meaning he was concerned for her and she wasn't talking, and so he wanted to find out. And he says the private investigators, they just didn't find anything. He said they followed her for like a couple of hours a month for about 11 to 12 months. Interesting. Police thought that was strange considering he waited 2 days to report her missing. He would spend money over the course of a year to have her followed, but when she suddenly disappears, he's silent. He doesn't contact those private investigators he knew. He doesn't tell police. He doesn't tell anyone. He waits. Kind of strange. Then, police received 2 letters that were written on typewriters. One of the letters, the first one, basically painted Doreen as this just terrible person. It said that she had been cheating on her husband, she slept around the office to get promoted, and she was a harlot. The second letter basically stated that Stephen was the one to kill her and dump her body off the side of a road. They sent these letters to a psycholinguistics guy, and he basically combed those letters over, and he determined that both of those letters were actually likely written by someone who knew Doreen very, very well. Specifically, he said it appeared to have been written by her husband, both of them, in this attempt to throw off the investigation, to make him actually look less guilty. They then found out that the first letter was actually typed on Stephen's mother's typewriter. Yes, you can actually do that. You can forensically determine which typewriter more than likely wrote it. The second letter, however, was not written with that typewriter. Interestingly, Lorna Dobson, Doreen's sister, did not believe that Stephen had anything to do with her disappearance. And neither did their mom, Laura. She didn't think Stephen did anything to her, that he was playing the part of a grieving husband who was really trying to look for her. And the case of Doreen Marfeo's disappearance just sort of went cold. And then 1999 came along. Stephen, who continued living in the house that he shared with Doreen for about 12 years, he shot and killed his ex-girlfriend, Laura Vincent, a mother to 2 teenage girls. He also shot Laura's current boyfriend, Salvatore Puglio. He survived, but Laura was pronounced dead. He fled the scene and went to a remote location where a police officer managed to catch him. Stephen pulled out a gun. He told the officer he was alive for 9 years too long and that he felt guilty over Doreen's disappearance. He then put the gun to his head and pulled the trigger. He killed himself. Some took this as a confession, but Doreen has never been found. And until that day comes, no one will really know what happened to her. How anyone could murder their own parent, thankfully I will never understand. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Dixie Hollier. Viewer discretion is advised. Dixie Hollier was a single mom to 3 children. She had 2 teenage girls and a 5-year-old son. And the family lived in Burbank, California, or that area, and she actually worked with Warner Brothers. One of her daughters was Amber Bray. Her and Dixie had a very strange relationship. Amber was always fighting with her mom with regards to things like curfew, doing chores. Once a fantastic student and a cheerleader, she began to ditch school, and she ended up dating a 21-year-old named Jeffrey Ayers. Apparently, Jeffrey and Amber were making plans to eventually get married and move in together. On January 16th, 1996, all of that would come to a head. The children in the home were awakened by the sound of a gunshot and screaming. They run to the bedroom and they see 21-year-old Jeffrey Ayers on top of their mother, Dixie. He is beating her and stabbing her, and he had already shot her. According to one of Amber's younger siblings, one of the younger siblings tried to pick up the phone to call 911, but Amber ripped the cord out of the wall. But they were able to finally call 911, and police arrived, and Jeffrey was still there, and so they arrested him after he surrendered. In questioning, he would say that it was all him, just him, acted alone. He said that Amber had told him that her mom was abusing her, and so he just said, I'll kill the mom then. And that Amber had absolutely nothing to do with this, no knowledge or anything. That is until they found letters that Amber had sent, and he had sent some back, literally planning the murder. In one of the letters, Amber wrote to Jeffrey, I think what we should do is you should break into the house and have someone kill my sister and also my mom. And in the letters, she discussed about how she would inherit over $300,000 in cash. This was enough evidence to then arrest both people for the murder. Amber did not have any involvement in the actual murder itself, the physical act, but she was still arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder and also of the murder itself, because that's just how the law works. It was evident throughout all of the evidence, throughout all of the testimonies, that Amber hated her mom. She wanted to get $300,000, and she wanted to be with her older boyfriend without any issues. And she was also willing to have one of her siblings killed to make it look like this wasn't targeted towards her mom only. Both Amber and Jeffrey were found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and first-degree murder. Both were sentenced to life in prison without parole. First there was a murder, then a missing person. Was it connected? Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Diane and Hugh Harlan. Viewer discretion is advised. This strange little story happened here in Morro Bay, California. This is an area where a lot of fishermen would make a lot of money. What you're seeing here is not an old-timey photo from the 1800s. This is a couple from 1982, Diane and Hugh Harlan, considered a very eccentric, quirky, and odd little couple. Hugh was one of the more well-known local fishermen in the area, described by people who knew him as an oddball, but a good guy. Some people considered Hugh to be just a little more than weird. However, Hugh not only did his own fishermen work there, but when he was done with his day, he would help other fishermen load up their boats, and he would take hours out of his day helping other people. He and his wife Diane had a very odd relationship. They were seen fighting kind of publicly all the time, where Hugh was very social, Diane was very unsocial. She became known as the dog lady. She seemed to care more about her dogs than she did about her own husband. But at the same time, she was also a nice enough person, despite their stormy relationship. On October 13th, 1982, the badly decomposed body of a woman was found just off the shore of the beach. This body would later be identified as Diane Harlan. She had been strangled to death with a dog leash. She had actually gone missing 2 weeks prior, but Hugh never reported her missing. The dogs returned home the night she took them out for a walk, that she never came home. He said he thought nothing of it because she would leave all the time. He told police that the dogs all came home with their leashes that night. However, when police presented him with the evidence of, well, she was strangled with one of your dog leashes, he then said, oh, none of the dogs came home with their leashes that night. Police considered Hugh a suspect at that point, and then he lawyered up. He actually tries to say that Diane likely died of an aneurysm because she had medical issues, and that this wasn't a homicide, but it was. However, they never had enough evidence to ever charge him with her murder, and Hugh goes about his life. 4 years later, November 1st, 1986, the vehicle of Hugh Harlan is found abandoned off the side of the road. And this is in Cambria, California. His friends located it and then found his keys had been thrown in the bushes. There was no signs of foul play, and Hugh was nowhere to be found. Hugh Harlan has never been seen again. Some people believe that Hugh just made himself disappear and he threw the keys in the bushes and wandered off on his own. Some believe that Hugh may have been murdered by the same person who killed his wife. Or he was maybe trying to escape the fact that he murdered his wife. Hugh Harlan has a very unique appearance, if you will. If he were to have disappeared and just gone somewhere, this is a man that would be noticed by people. I mean, let's just be honest, he would be. Unless Hugh drastically changed his appearance to make himself blend in. But the fact of the matter is that this case aired on Unsolved Mysteries, and despite that, nobody has ever come forward to state that they know where he is or that they've even seen him. So, is Hugh Harlan just that good of making himself vanish? Or is Hugh Harlan dead? It makes you question, did Hugh kill his wife or did he not? There was no physical evidence to say that he did. However, his story kind of changed from time to time. He didn't report her missing for 2 full weeks that she was gone. They were observed by the public as having a very rocky, tumultuous relationship. But he didn't benefit from her murder. He didn't get anything from it. He also never really seemed to be shaken up about it. But everyone reacts differently to things like this. And so in the end, you have just a very strange story. A very quirky couple. One of them is found murdered. The other disappears 4 years later, never to be seen again. Hugh Harlan is also missing his thumb and his forefinger. So that's another characteristic that should be easy to spot, along with his, big beard of an appearance. So if anybody recognizes him or knows anything about this case, please contact the Morro Police Department at 805-772-6225. Maybe you can help solve a murder and help find a missing man. The Highway of Tears has claimed many victims. This is just one. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Roxanne Chiara. Viewer discretion is advised. Roxanne Chiara was born on January 5th, 1979, And I hope I said her last name correctly. It's been hard to find a correct pronunciation of it. But Roxanne was actually raised in a foster home, and this was in Quesnel in British Columbia, Canada. She grew up in the care of Mildred Chiara, who also had other children. Roxanne was actually described as a really kind of happy, bubbly child growing up. But as she got older, she began having issues with attending school. And unfortunately, she would fall into the wrong crowd of people. By age like 12 or 13, she's already starting to experiment with drugs and alcohol. And by age 15, she's already practicing something called survival sex, which I guess is a form of sex trafficking. In June of 1994, Roxanne would contact Mildred and say, I think I want to turn things around now. Mildred had talked to her, and Roxanne said, I want to enter some kind of rehab center. So she spoke to Mildred at their home in Quesnel, but she said she had to go to Prince George to collect her belongings, and she would come back to Quesnel the next day, and then they would go take her to the rehab center. But that did not happen. When Roxanne left Mildred's home that day, it was the last time that Mildred would ever hear or see her again. A few days into July, she is confirmed to be seen by a friend of hers. Roxanne tells this friend, I'm going to be going to, hang out with a customer. The friend said she said goodbye to Roxanne. She watched Roxanne walk around the corner of a building, and that was it. That was the last time that anyone saw or heard from Roxanne ever again. 1 month later, along Highway 16, the 719-kilometer stretch of highway between Prince George and Prince Rupert in British Columbia, also known as the Highway of Tears, the murdered body of 15-year-old Roxanne was found, thrown in some bushes. This was very clear to police that this was a homicide. They believe she was killed somewhere else and then just thrown off the side of the road as if she were a bag of trash. Police had some tips here and there. They investigated leads, but it's never come to anything. I don't know if they found out who this particular customer was that she was supposed to be hanging out with. They've gotten no forensic evidence from the crime scene or her body, and her case has just gone unsolved. Yet another woman found alongside the Highway of Tears with no closure. Depending on where you read, there could be anywhere between 18 victims to over 80 victims of missing or murdered women along this highway. If you have information, please call 877-543-4822. She was last seen alive outside of a convenience store, and she wouldn't be found for another year. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Tammy Albertson. Viewer discretion is advised. 16-year-old Tammy Albertson was described as bubbly and outgoing. She loved Bon Jovi, Billy Idol, Boyz II Men. She loved reading. She loved walking on the beach and collecting seashells. She was just a really happy teenager. She lived here with her family in Tillamook, Oregon. I know she had a couple of siblings, and they lived with their mom and their stepdad. It was March 22nd, 1992. Tammy Albertson would be dropped off at the Moeller Co-op convenience store by her stepdad, Jack. She was observed using the payphone just outside of the store to, call her boyfriend. Her stepdad, Jack Jameson, then reportedly went to work immediately after dropping her off. But Tammy was never seen again after this. The family tried to report her missing, but the police said, well, you gotta wait 48 hours because this was also around spring break. And she's a teenager, she'll show up. She didn't. After a couple of days, they started to actually investigate this now as a missing person, missing child. While they are searching, they are also trying to investigate all walks of her life to see, who may be in her life. They found out she had a boyfriend who lived in Portland. And as a matter of fact, the sheriff's department would essentially notify the media that they were confident that Tammy was a runaway who was in the Portland area. They searched for a few weeks, but eventually the case just goes cold. Almost a year later, on March 17th, 1993, in an area referred to as God's Valley near the Tillamook County line, skeletal remains are found. They are soon confirmed to be that of 16-year-old Tammy Albertson. Police stated that she was killed by homicidal violence, but the exact cause of death has not been released. I don't think they can actually pinpoint to the day that she was killed, but it sounds like the belief is she was killed the day she was last seen. There were two persons of interest pretty much the entire time. Her boyfriend, who allegedly was cleared because I guess they said he was confirmed to be in Portland at the time. The other person of interest was her stepdad, Jack Jameson, because he was the last person to see her alive. However, police have not found any actual evidence, forensic or otherwise, to link either of those two potential suspects to her murder. I don't know if they looked in to confirm if Jack Jameson went to work immediately afterwards, like he said. It sounds like some of the family believes he did it, some of the family believes he didn't. But unfortunately, they are no closer to knowing who did this. If you have information about the murder of Tammy Albertson, please call 503-815-3320. It's been over 45 years, but there is still a chance for answers. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Sandra Carter Davis. Viewer discretion is advised. This case occurred in 1978 here in Sallisaw, Oklahoma. Sandra Carter Davis was a 35-year-old mother. Her daughter was, I think, 3 years old at the time this case occurred, and so she really doesn't, unfortunately, have many memories of her mom. All she really knows is that her mom was last seen on June 2nd, 1978, here in this building that used to hold Ray's Bar. Sandra was seen leaving that bar, but she never got home, and she was never seen alive again. It was Thanksgiving Day, 1978. This is about 5 months after she was missing. Alongside this road here, there were two hunters in this wooded area when they stumbled across something sticking out of a shallow grave. They realized that this was the remains of a person, so police were called. They were able to determine right away that this was the body of a woman based on the clothing they were wearing, and it took some time, but they were finally able to identify the body. It was 35-year-old Sandra Carter Davis. She had a couple broken ribs, and it was clear that she had been stabbed to death. This was a very violent death. Her daughter was told growing up that her mom died of natural causes, but when she was 11 years old, the daughter found an article about her mom's case, and that's how she learned that her mom was murdered. And ever since then, as she has grown up and now she's an adult, she has been trying to find justice for her mom. Police did apparently have a person of interest from the get-go, someone they considered a suspect, but they have never named that man out loud. According to one article, that man somehow just sort of slipped away from Sallisaw and he moved on. In 2013, I think a cold case team was working on this case and they had taken some items found from the crime scene and they're trying to process it for DNA. And in 2013, they stated then that the same person of interest / suspect is the same guy from 1978. But again, they haven't said his name. And they've never arrested him or anything like that. Now, I don't know if this is the same man, but this guy here, Herman Edward Lamb Jr., was apparently also named a suspect. He had been considered a suspect in a whole bunch of murders, including the murders of his ex-wife and her 3 kids. But this man died in prison. I just don't know if he is the same person of interest from Sandra's case or not. But he's dead now, so if you have information about the murder of Sandra Carter Davis, please call 918-775-9155. Did this man kill the $5 doc? Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Dr. Sebastian Russo. Viewer discretion is advised. It was February 27th, 1981 in Baltimore, Maryland. A person who lived next to a popular doctor's office heard a very loud noise sometime around 9 or 9:30 p.m. coming from the office. So that neighbor called police, and police arrive. Inside, they find the body of Dr. Sebastian Russo, who was nicknamed the $5 Doc. He had a single gunshot wound to his upper left chest. His keys to the office were on the floor next to him, and the cabinet where he stored medications and drugs for his patients was open, and presumably there were things stolen from it. Immediately, police, seen here looking through the case file, their first thought was this was a murder by possibly a patient of his who needed some kind of fix, and knew that Dr. Russo kept medications and drugs in his office. Dr. Sebastian Russo was born and raised in Sicily in Italy, and he moved to the United States sometime around 1959. He had married several years prior to that, and the two of them had a child, which was born in 1957. Sebastian Russo was considered like the nicest guy. He offered very inexpensive medical care. He saw dozens upon dozens of patients every single day. He made house calls. He worked from 7 a.m. until nighttime, like 9:30 p.m., almost every day. He was someone who was trying to help and aid as many people as he could. And then someone just did this to him, and it completely destroyed the community. This was one of those genuinely good people. But to this very day, nobody knows who killed him. According to witnesses who were in the doctor's office in the waiting room probably an hour or so prior to the shooting happening, there was a man in the office who fit this description. They came up with this composite drawing. The man was in the office, or the waiting room. He left, he came back, he left, he came back, and was, they think, seen in the company of a woman, and that he may have gotten into a blue van at some point. But they don't know, because this was like the last person in the waiting room when the last patient before him left. So they don't know if this was actually his killer, or if this guy was seen and then someone came in after. There was no forced entry, so like no one kicked the door down or anything. But Dr. Russo also opened his door to anyone. But sadly, this case went cold pretty quickly, and they just haven't gotten anywhere with it. So if you have information about the murder of Dr. Russo, please call 443-902-4824. Falling cheese would lead to one of the worst deaths imaginable. Viewer discretion is advised. Pictured here was 74-year-old Giacomo Chiapparini, and he lived in Italy. He was actually a local producer of a cheese called Grana Padano, which I guess is similar to Parmesan cheese. He produced this cheese in a warehouse in Bergamo, and he had thousands and thousands, like 15 to 20,000 wheels of this aging cheese in his warehouse. The shelves would go up to 33 feet. Each wheel of this cheese, I guess, weighs somewhere around 20 kilograms. Or roughly 44 pounds. Well, on a day back in 2023, he was tending to these wheels of cheese, when all of a sudden one of the 30+ feet high shelves breaks. It gave away, which made all of the cheese come crashing down. This then created what they called a domino effect, where a bunch of the other shelves began to collapse. And in the middle, between these two sections of shelves, was Giacomo. An alert neighbor heard an alarm going off, because I guess there's some kind of alarm of like the cleaning apparatus they have. And so the alarm kind of made the neighbor go check, and he came into this scene of just thousands of wheels of cheese collapsed on the ground, and Giacomo is nowhere to be found. So an ambulance was called, and it took them over 12 hours to move these thousands of wheels of cheese to finally find Giacomo, and he was buried underneath just so many of these wheels of cheese. They actually had to use specialists who normally will dig up like rubble and boulders in search and rescue type things in order to help rescue him. But sadly, there was no rescuing to be made. He was crushed to death and suffocated underneath thousands and thousands of pounds of these hard wheels of cheese. It was just an unfortunate accident. I mean, this is typically how they store these wheels of cheese, not just in his warehouse, but all over the place. It's a very normal practice, and it's extremely uncommon to have this type of incident, but unfortunately it happened right when he was in between 20,000 wheels of cheese that just collapsed on him. I can't imagine like that initial just reaction of hearing that happening and then just looking up and seeing all of this falling on you. I don't know if he was killed instantly or not. People have survived being crushed by rubble before, so I don't know. I just hope that he did not suffer very long or at all. A car would explode in a peaceful neighborhood back in 1990, and this case remains unsolved. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Officer Dennis Wustenhoff. Viewer discretion is advised. Dennis John Wustenhoff, who was born in 1948, would later go on to become a decorated war hero. He had fought in the Vietnam War. He would then go on to get married, and he got a job as a police officer in Long Island, New York. For the most part, he had a very happy marriage. He was an incredible father to 3 children, who at the time this case occurred were between the ages of 10 and 14. Dennis absolutely doted upon his children. He was just the best dad. He became an undercover police officer there in New York. So he would have done a lot of work that obviously he couldn't really talk about to many people. And there was a point where people thought, well, maybe that's what led to what happened. Dennis and his family lived in a very peaceful neighborhood in Patchogue, which I guess is a neighborhood in Long Island, New York. On the morning of February 15th, 1990, the neighborhood would be completely just jolted by the sound of an explosion. A car had exploded just outside the Wustenhoff house, and the neighbors were horrified to find that there was somebody inside of it. Later confirmed to be 41-year-old Dennis Wustenhoff. He was dead. The explosion ripped through the neighborhood, but it went through his house as well. It shattered like the windows to his home. Luckily, his 3 children had all been dropped off at school that morning by their mother, and Dennis's wife was also at work that morning. There was a time where they thought, well, was this something to do with the undercover work? Did somebody find out? Did a criminal operation discover his true identity and do something, retaliate? Well, the investigation has actually been pretty quiet, like they haven't really released much. But Dennis's now adult children say they have found out, and everybody knows this now is confirmed, that Dennis was actually having an affair with another officer's wife. And that person's name has never been released to the public. The family has since come to terms with that aspect, the affair, but they all said it certainly doesn't condone murder. However, the police have never actually arrested or indicted or anything this individual, whoever he is. Because I guess, allegedly, there's just no evidence and there's no proof. That man, whoever he is, I guess, lawyered up pretty quickly, which does not always mean a person is guilty of anything. It's honestly the smart thing to do, anyway. But to this day, nobody knows who actually planted that bomb and who killed Dennis. If you have information about the murder of Dennis Wustenhoff, please call 1-800-220-TIPS. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of William Donald Leach. Viewer discretion is advised. I don't have a lot of information on this case, but William Donald Leach, who I guess would also go by Frederick Leach, was living near Laytonville, California in 1976. He lived about a mile south of the city. But he was last seen in the city of Laytonville on March 17th, 1976. He had a daughter, and I guess she went to his house after they realized he was missing, and when they got there, they found that his house was ransacked. And she said there was dinner, I guess, out on the table. There was a whole bunch of stuff stolen from his house, including all of the vehicles he owned. He owned several. Like a few cars were stolen, and then a Harley Davidson was stolen. He was a mechanic who absolutely loved cars and motorcycles, and that's why he had so many. His daughter says there was also blood spatter found in his house. And he also had a bus, I guess, parked on his property. There was an armchair in that bus that was covered with a blanket. When she removed the blanket, the armchair was saturated in blood. And then on a second property on the property he lived at, she said she found a picture of a goat's head with a cross on a grave, and on that was his name written. Police also discovered that a couple of weeks prior to his disappearance, William was seen, I guess, limping around, and he looked in pain. He told people that he had gotten into a big fight over some kind of dispute with a couple of people, and basically they kicked his ass, they beat him up. And apparently this was because they wanted to buy certain things from him, I'm presuming his vehicles, but he either said no or wanted more money or something. So there is that possibility that that might be linked to his disappearance and possible murder, but it doesn't sound like they know who it was who did that to him. William Donald Leach has never been seen again. He has never been heard from again, and he is presumed dead. But police have nothing to go on in terms of who did this to him, and even if those people are still around now. But, I mean, there is a chance, I guess, there could be. So if you have any information, please call 707-463-4095. She was last seen leaving this center, and she has not been seen since. Hello, true crimerers. This is another missing or murdered Indigenous woman case, and this is the case of Kiaya Blue Harding. Viewer discretion is advised. At the time this case happened, Kiaya Blue Harding was just 19 years old, and I'm not 100% sure what tribe she is a part of, but she is Indigenous. Kiaya was at a point in her life in 2018 where she was trying to turn things around. Unfortunately, she had recently become an addict, specifically to methamphetamine, and at times she had something called meth-induced schizophrenia. But she was, at this point, trying to reverse course. She was trying to better her life and get help. And so she sought that help here at this place called Tumbleweed, which this is in Bighorn County, Montana. And by all accounts, she was doing great. Kiaya was still just as lively as ever. She was down to earth. And despite her issues with addiction, she was really loving her life. She would typically be staying at the Tumbleweed place for days on end, sometimes weeks on end. And she wouldn't go back to her home with her mom very often. Kiaya was last seen leaving this location on July 25th, 2018. However, she was not reported missing until close to the end of August 2018. This is because, her mom thought that she was gone for days or weeks on end, and she always came home. But once she found out that even the Tumbleweed Center hadn't seen her, they reported her missing. Search parties were immediately organized, and they began to comb through the area looking for her, but they had absolutely no luck. They did not find any physical traces of her. While canvassing the streets in the neighborhood that this occurred, they did learn that Kiaya was seen in the presence of a man who I guess had been recently accused of rape. But no one can really confirm if this is true or not in terms of if she was actually with him. They also learned that Kiaya was recently seen with people who may be involved in human trafficking. This is a big issue, especially with people who are addicts or especially Indigenous women, and they've investigated that route but have not come up with anything yet. Kiaya was also allegedly seen in Phoenix, Arizona on at least 2 occasions, but they have not been able to corroborate that. They also found out that someone purchased a bus ticket on the day she disappeared, and that was to go to Colorado. But they have no proof or evidence that that bus ticket was ever actually used. They also searched the location where she was supposed to be going, and she wasn't there. They then thought maybe she went to New Mexico to visit her boyfriend, but she wasn't there either. Kiaya deserves to be found, and if you have any information, please call 833-560-2065. She was brutally murdered inside of a Wendy's, and nobody really seems to know why. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Christy Grega. Viewer discretion is advised. Christy Grega was born on May 27th, 1982, and she lived most of her life in the Scranton, Pennsylvania area. Christy was one of 3 kids. She also had 2 younger brothers. Christy excelled in school, always got fantastic grades. She was definitely a go-getter. She had goals. She rose the ranks working at a Wendy's restaurant, where eventually she became an assistant manager, and that was going to help her get her way through college. As a matter of fact, on August 28th, 2000, that was going to be her first day at college, and she was beyond excited to start. But sadly, she would not get to. On August 27th, 2000, Christy would go to open the Wendy's restaurant, and this would have been a couple of hours before the restaurant was officially open to customers. When one of her employees comes to the restaurant, he's knocking on the door, but she's not letting him in. He looks in the drive-thru window and he can see her purse. He also saw her shirt. So the employee goes next door to the grocery store where he contacts police. Police arrive and they break the door to get inside. And they discover the horrifically bloodied body of 18-year-old Christy Grega. It was determined that she had been beaten with a hammer many times and stabbed with some kind of knife or sharp instrument. The hammer was at the crime scene, but the knife was not. There was blood, there was hair, and there were chunks of skull all over the place. About $2,000 was missing from the till. Christie was not sexually assaulted. I guess a couple of days later, they would end up finding one of Christie's paychecks at a local park with some discarded shoes with blood evidence on it. The shoes were determined to be ones that were at the crime scene because there were shoe impressions in blood left behind. They were very large and unusual shoes. With the shoes, they also found bloody towels and bloody gloves. Based on the unusual shoes, they were able to determine that they came from an employee at Wendy's named Andrew Vacara, whose photo I cannot find. And from what I understand, they also found, I guess, a thumbprint at the crime scene that later matched him. So he was arrested and charged with the murder. But the thing is nobody really knows why he did it. He never had any issues there. I mean, maybe it was robbery, but the murder was so brutal. It almost seemed as if he took the money just to make it look like a robbery. But they never really established why he did it. But they did have forensic evidence that linked him directly to this murder. Eventually, he goes on trial and he is convicted and found guilty of the murder. He is sentenced to death. But in 2002, he ends his own life in prison. So in a way, Christie did get the justice she deserved. 4 women murdered, and it would be dog hair and tires that helped lead them to the killer. Oh, God, Jesus. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of James Michael Randall. Viewer discretion is advised. October 20th, 1995, Tampa, Florida. A pizza delivery driver finds a body lying off the side of the road. The body is later identified as a woman named Wendy Evans. She had been strangled to death, and she was left out nude. She was believed to be a prostitute in the area. Near her body, they found tire tracks, which they would later find out were new tires that had a pebble stuck in one of the little treads. And then using UV lights, they discovered dog hair on her body, which would later determine to come from a pug. A couple of weeks later, another body is found in Tampa. The victim, Peggy Darnell, another known prostitute in the area. She had also been left nude and she had been strangled to death. However, her body was so badly decomposed that they were not able to get any forensic evidence off of her. In January of 1996, another body would show up. A 27-year-old sex worker in the area named Cynthia Pugh, also found strangled to death. At her crime scene near her body, they also found dog hairs and pink fibers. They also found traces of pink fibers on the first victim. On Cynthia's body was a chewed up cigarette wrapper that they were able to swab and found DNA on. Police were looking into if there were any other victims, and they found one. 16 months prior, a prostitute in Florida named LaDonna Jean Sellars, she was in Clearwater, her body was found nude, also strangled to death. Police contacted tire specialists to see if they can identify this tire, and they did. When they did so, they found out that the tire sales were really, really rare, and they actually found like one receipt. It led back to a woman named Terry Jo Howard. She purchased those tires. When the police go near her home, they see her outside holding a pug. Police set up a covert operation where they posed as dog groomers in the area and offer to groom this dog, and she agrees. Turns out the hairs from this pug were the exact hairs found on some of the bodies. When they get a warrant now to search her apartment, they find chewed up cigarette wrappers all over the ground. That's because the pug was addicted to nicotine and ate cigarettes and then spit them out. Inside the apartment, they found this bed with a red rug underneath it. Turns out the red fibers from this rug are the same red fibers found with some of the victims. Terry Jo Howard was dating a man named James Randall, and he was a piece of shit. Abusive and just terrible. So they basically end up getting a warrant to get his DNA. His DNA matches the cigarette wrapper left on one of the bodies. So he was arrested and charged with the murders. Digging into his past, they discovered that he had been convicted of twice raping his ex-wife, Linda. He only spent 6 years in prison for it. He's also suspected of the murder of a woman named Holly Jo Coate, who was a friend of his ex-wife. So while he's in prison, awaiting his trials for these murders, his girlfriend goes to, well, now ex-girlfriend, goes to visit him. He admits to her that he has a fetish when it comes to choking and murder, and that he killed these other women so that he wasn't compelled to kill her. Gee, what a nice guy. She would end up testifying against him at his trial. He would only end up being convicted of the murders of Wendy Evans and Cynthia Pugh. Allegedly, I guess the other victims, there wasn't enough evidence that they were able to convict him of those. But in the end, it didn't really matter because he was convicted and sentenced to death. He got 2 death sentences. But then his lawyers would successfully appeal that sentence, and the courts reversed his death sentences, and they re-sentenced him to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The man is a monster, and thankfully he will not ever be able to hurt any innocent person ever again. This is an unsolved murder case with one very bizarre detail. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Donna Dahl. Viewer discretion is advised. At the time of this case, Donna Dahl was a 21-year-old college student in DeKalb, Illinois. She was attending Northern Illinois University, and she was working at the Swen Parson Library part-time there on campus. She lived on the dorms, and she had been dating a fellow student there named Charles, but Charles was apparently controlling and a little possessive and kind of mean at times. In the summer of 1970, she would go to Pennsylvania where she was doing a foreign language program, and she met another guy. So when she got back, she broke it off with Charles and started to kind of slowly date this other guy in Pennsylvania. This was really upsetting to Charles, but everyone in her life was happy she did this because Charles was just kind of a douche. On Friday, October 2nd, 1970, Donna Dahl had plans with a good friend of hers. The friend was supposed to pick Donna up from her library job that night, but when the friend got there, Donna wasn't there. She allegedly had clocked out at 9:59 p.m., but was no longer there. So the friend assumed Donna just forgot we had plans, and so the friend just went home. Basically, over the course of the next couple of days, they kind of just slowly began to get concerned that she wasn't anywhere. She hadn't come back to her apartment, and her roommates were not concerned at first, but became concerned after 2 or 3 days. And so finally, they called police after about 3 days to report her missing. Her ex-boyfriend Charles takes this very seriously. He begins the charge. He's leading the search for her. Charles leads the search, and then he abruptly stops that search, which just so happens to be in the vicinity of his apartment. And he also stopped that search just a few hundred yards short of where Donna's body was eventually found. Charles would then be called back to the scene where he ID'd her body that was decomposing. He was a pallbearer at her funeral. He buried her in a pair of earrings he gifted her prior. He was very involved. Donna's cause of death was ultimately ruled as suffocation. Someone put like a bag or a pillowcase over her and suffocated her. Strange though, because they did not find any fibers in her system, which is common with suffocations like that. But the most bizarre part of her autopsy, there were over 5 pounds worth of potatoes in her stomach. 5 pounds. Nobody knows if she was forced to eat those potatoes because the coroner ruled that she didn't die until about 48 hours after she was last seen. So did someone keep her captive and for some reason made her eat a bunch of potatoes? Why? There has never been an explanation for the 5 to 6 pounds of potatoes found in her system. No explanation at all. Now, I'm Irish and I absolutely love potatoes, but even I could not eat 5 or 6 pounds worth of potatoes in one sitting. I highly doubt Donna could do that either unless she was forced to. But again, you have to ask, why? Other peculiar details about when her body was found is that she had been last seen wearing a long trench coat, but when she was found, the trench coat was missing and she was wearing a jacket that did not belong to her. But nobody knows whose jacket it is. Her purse and wallet and all that were also missing and have never been found. Her ex-boyfriend Charles was not considered a person of interest. He was considered the suspect in this. His almost forced involvement in this was very suspicious. The other boyfriend in Pennsylvania was very quickly ruled out because they confirmed he was in Pennsylvania the entire time, and they had no evidence to link him to this and no motive. Charles, however, has a motive because he was really upset when she broke up with him, and he was possessive, controlling, and mean. Just 2 days after he was named a suspect officially, he tries to kill himself. He fails. When he's released from the hospital, eventually, he hires a lawyer. However, they never were able to establish any physical evidence to connect him to her murder at all. We're talking no forensic evidence whatsoever. She wasn't sexually assaulted. The, murder weapon, pillowcase, bag, whatever the case may be, wasn't found. And eventually, he just sort of goes about his life. He moves to Chicago, and nobody knows where he is now. And in the end, Donna Dahl is murdered. She is found with 5 or 6 pounds worth of boiled potatoes in her stomach, and she's suffocated and thrown off the side of a road. And nobody knows who did it officially. And so her murder has gone unsolved, and this has been a cold case for decades. But somebody out there might have information. I know this is an older case, but you never know. If you have information, please call 815-748-8400. If you can help bring some answers, closure, anything, or justice, please do so. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Demetra Hill. Viewer discretion is advised. At the time of this case, Demetra Hill was a 19-year-old mother to one young son, and she lived in Atlanta, Georgia. Unfortunately, I don't really have any photos of Demetra, but this is another photo of her and her son. But on December 3rd, 2001, it would be the last time that Demetra Hill's mom would ever see her alive. Demetra had been hanging out with a good friend of hers, her best friend, that day. And at one point, her and her friend come into contact with a man they had never met before. This man offered them a ride, and they said, okay, because Demetra and her friend were, at the time, they were very trusting people. This guy seemed nice and charming, and he was cute to them. And so, eventually, after they're kind of driving around for a bit, this guy would bring them both back to their house. Her friend goes inside, but Demetra ends up telling the friend, hey, I'll be back in a minute. And her and the guy, the stranger, they end up taking off in the car. That is the last time that anybody sees Demetra alive again. Within a day, Demetra's mom ends up filing a missing persons report. And initially, they were having a really difficult time investigating this because they didn't know who the man was. They had a description of his car. It would ultimately be Demetra's mom. This is obviously a much younger photo of Demetra, but she ended up working kind of alongside with the police, and she ended up tracking down, based on the car, who this man was. It was this man, Joseph Brown. So police bring him in for questioning. He denies having anything to do with whatever may have happened to Demetra, and so they have no choice but to let him go. But then Demetra's mom's like, She goes to Joseph Brown's house and confronts him herself. He becomes super angry and agitated, and she ends up basically running away, and then contacts police again. This time he's brought back in for questioning, and this time he says, well, I did have consensual sex with Demetra. Because people noticed the day after she went missing that he had these big scratch marks down his face. He said that was given to him during this consensual sex. And then in 2002, they would find a body that had been burned and cut up. It would take dental records to finally identify that body as Demetra Hill. This was clearly a homicide. But police still didn't have enough evidence to arrest him. That is until they found out he was basically a serial strangler. He had strangled family members before and ex-girlfriends. Never fatally, but then he got arrested for trying to kidnap and also strangle another girlfriend. And so that was finally able to kind of help them connect this to Demetra Hill. And so what he ends up doing is taking a plea deal for aggravated assault and kidnapping for both women, and he only got 25 years in prison. A Halloween night murder, and it took 41 years to the day to finally arrest the killer. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Clifford Smith. Viewer discretion is advised. At the time of this case, Clifford Smith, pictured here with his brother, was 24 years old and he was married. He and his family were living in Jackson County, Indiana. It was Halloween night 1982, Clifford was at, I guess, a friend's house that night with several other people. And then at one point, he leaves this house in the company of another man named Ronald Anderson. But after that, Clifford was never seen again. His wife would report him missing just a couple of days later. Sadly, in December of 1982, Clifford's body was found, and he had been shot through the back of his head. And it was evident he was shot with a shotgun. The police there in Indiana were investigating this case, but I guess they did not have any evidence to show who did this. But it sounds like Clifford's family knew the entire time who killed him. They suspected it was Mr. Ronald Anderson, the guy he was seen leaving the house with. From what I understand, Ronald Anderson had connections to the family. I think he was a brother-in-law, I think. But the case goes cold for decades. It would take 41 years for police to finally make an arrest. They said through new investigative techniques, I'm not really sure what that means, and after combing through all of the files and re-interviewing several witnesses, they arrested Meth Head Santa? No! Golly gee. They arrested 61-year-old Ronald Anderson, the guy he was seen leaving the party with. Well, they had new evidence from new testimony that Ronald Anderson had retrieved a shotgun just before leaving the house with Clifford. He then returns that shotgun to where he got it later that night or earlier that morning. So the 61-year-old man has been charged with the murder. He was arrested on Halloween in 2023. I'm filming this in May of 2024. A trial has not occurred yet. I see that his trial was actually set for April of 2024, but it doesn't look like it's occurred yet. So hopefully that trial happens soon, and hopefully Clifford Smith and his family get the justice they all very rightfully deserve. The body of a teenage girl would be found here in this location, and now they need the public's help to find out who put her there. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Clarissa Castro. Viewer discretion is advised. Clarissa Castro was one of, I believe, 5 children. This is obviously a much younger photo of her pictured with her sister, Celestina. The two of them were really close. They seemed to be the best of friends. And Celestina was always kind of like the protector to Clarissa. By the time this case occurs, Clarissa is now 14 years old. She's living at her home with her mom and 3 younger siblings. And her sister Celestina is now living out on her own, or at least out of the family house. It was October 13th, 1991. Clarissa's mom, I believe, was working a late night job. And so that day, Clarissa was having a little get-together at the house while her 3 younger siblings were also there. Celestina had gone to the house over the course of that day a couple of times to check in on her siblings. Then later that night, Celestina goes back to the house and sees that her sister is asleep. But Celestina had something in her gut that was just telling her something was wrong. And her gut feeling was right. Later on that evening, one of the other younger siblings says that they saw Clarissa actually leaving the house and getting into a car with an unknown individual. They can't tell if she got in the car willingly or if she was forced in the car. The next morning, their mom got home and Clarissa was still not there. There was, I guess, issues with being able to file a missing persons report, but Clarissa never came home. In December of 1991, a young boy was walking down this path, and here he found a body, a decomposing human body. The body was found in the Otay Valley area of Chula Vista, California, which is where she lived. They could not determine how this young woman died. They also could not determine who this young woman was. And then I think another month goes by, and finally they're able to file a missing persons report on Clarissa. But it wouldn't be until around 1994 or so when the Chula Vista Police Department was doing an audit on their missing persons reports. That's when they discovered that the body they found was actually that of 14-year-old Clarissa. Her death was ruled a homicide. They just don't know, or haven't released at least, how she died. And sadly, that's kind of where the mystery begins and also ends, because there has been 0 updates since. They have no leads, no tips. I don't know if they talked to the people who were at that gathering at her house or not. I'm assuming they did. She did have, I guess, some connections with local gangs, but they don't know if that's related or not either. So if you have information, please call 619-691-5151. In the late morning hours of October 8th, 2014, inside the walls of this home, a grisly discovery was made. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of the Chen family murders. Viewer discretion is advised. The Chen family lived here in this house in Guilderland, which is in Albany, New York. The family consisted of 39-year-old Jin Feng, his 38-year-old wife, Hai Yan Li, and their two sons, 10-year-old Anthony and 7-year-old Eddie. Jin Feng worked at a local Chinese restaurant, but he failed to show up for work one day, and that was very much unlike him. So his co-worker would go to their house on the morning of October 8th, 2014. When he walks inside, there is a nightmare. There is blood everywhere. All 4 members of the family had been murdered, and it appeared they had all been bludgeoned to death. At an autopsy, they would show that a claw hammer was the likely tool used to bludgeon all 4 members of the family, but some of them also had wounds to indicate that they may have been stabbed or cut with a knife. From what I understand, nothing was really stolen from the home. Hai Yan Li wasn't sexually assaulted, and so the motive was immediately unknown. Who would come into this house and kill anyone, but let alone 2 very young children, and so viciously? Police believe the murders took place sometime between 3:30 a.m. and 6:30 a.m. on the morning they were eventually found. Police found out that the night prior, Jin Feng was hosting some kind of poker/gambling party, but friends of the family would say that's not something they did. They really only ever played cards for fun with people. Police then uncovered the fact that Jin Feng had owned a restaurant, but that restaurant closed like 2 years prior. And they don't know how he was making an income because his wife stayed at home. They don't know what they were doing for money and how they could afford this house. There were reports that Jin Feng was working with undocumented Chinese restaurant workers, and he was doing off-the-book type stuff with that, which involved a lot of cash, I guess. But they have had no luck finding suspects or enemies to this family. They don't know if this was related to this so-called gambling party. They don't know if this had to do with the undocumented Chinese restaurant workers. They looked into other Chinese families that had been murdered in other states to see if they can connect it, but they couldn't. The family was well liked in the neighborhood. They never had to call police to their house or anything. Nobody knows why this happened, and certainly nobody knows who did it. But somebody out there has to know. So if you have information about the murder of the Chen family, please call 518-783-3212. Help get them justice.
And I'm looking for a single white male between 45 and 55 to have a good time, enjoy life, and just be all around happy.
Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Charles Barker. Viewer discretion is advised. By 1998, Charles Barker was a retired truck driver who had unfortunately lost his wife shortly before this case happened to a drunk driver. Charles, who was then living in Bossier City, Louisiana, was seeking company, distractions. This would take him to several different riverboat casinos there where he would gamble. Well, one day he meets a woman at the casino. This woman said her name was Deanna Ray. Well, the two of them hit it off and they began dating. At first, Charles's 2 adult daughters were happy that he just found someone to connect to. But when one of the daughters came to visit him in Louisiana from Texas, and when she met this woman, something just felt very strange about her. She almost came off like she was a gold digger. One of his daughters said she was like a barfly type personality, and she was unfriendly to the daughter. But eventually, she moves in with Charles. On September 2nd, 1998, some relatives would go check on Charles Barker because no one had seen or heard from him in several days. When they get to his home, the front door is open, and when they get into the kitchen, they find Charles. He had been shot to death once through the back of his head. The murder weapon was found inside the home. Charles had a safe that had all of his documents in it, but it was missing about $40,000 in cash. The next day, they end up finding Charles' car at the Shreveport airport. They found women's clothing and they found DNA. DNA that led them to a woman named Hazel Head. Hazel was on the run for committing arson. She had burned down the home of her ex-boyfriend. That was in Nebraska. Hazel Head was Deanna Ray, but Hazel was her actual name. She went by like 20 plus aliases. The physical evidence found at the murder scene definitely points to her being the killer, but she has never been seen since. She has been a wanted fugitive since 1998. Police want to make people aware that she has been someone who uses personal ads to find lonely hearts, to find men to rob, and, well, eventually perhaps kill. If you have information, call 318-965-0579. Beware of a woman with this voice.
And I'm looking for a single white male between 45 and 55 to have a good time, enjoy life,